The Last Resort, a Sapphic romantic comedy featuring one resort, one ex, and zero chill, by Riley Fox. Copyright 2025 by Riley Fox. All rights reserved. No part of this publication may be reproduced, stored, or transmitted in any form by any means, electronic, mechanical, photocopying, recording, scanning, or otherwise, without written permission from the publisher. It is illegal to copy this book, post it to a website, or distribute it by any other means without permission. This novel is entirely a work of fiction. The names, characters, and incidents portrayed in it are the work of the author's imagination. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, events or localities is entirely coincidental. Riley Fox asserts the moral right to be identified as the author of this work. Designations used by companies to distinguish their products are often claimed as trademarks. All brand names and product names used in this book and on its cover are trade names, service marks, trademarks, and registered trademarks of their respective owners. The publishers and the book are not associated with any product or vendor mentioned in this book. None of the companies referenced within the book have endorsed the book. Book cover by Dana Sacco.
Savannah, Chapter 1. Welcome to Coral Bay. The wheels of Savannah's suitcase clicked rhythmically against the stone pathway as she made her way through Coral Bay Resort's palm-lined entrance. Salt air filled her lungs, that perfect blend of ocean spray and tropical blooms that always made her shoulders drop just slightly. The Caribbean breeze caught the loose strands of hair that had escaped her low ponytail during the flight, and she tucked them behind her ear with practiced efficiency. Session. 3 years of running this event, and it still gave her that particular thrill of controlled chaos about to unfold. Her mental checklist scrolled automatically. Guest room assignments, dietary restrictions logged, heart deck setup confirmed, bar inventory stocked with enough rainbow cocktail umbrellas to outfit a small pride parade. The resort's white stucco buildings gleamed in the afternoon sun, their terracotta roofs a warm contrast against the cloudless sky. Bougainvillea cascaded over archways in brilliant magenta, and she could already hear the distant laughter of early arrivals claiming poolside loungers. Everything exactly as it should be. Well, look who's finally gracing us with her presence. Carmen's voice carried that familiar note of dry amusement as Savannah approached the front desk. Her assistant manager stood with one hip cocked against the polished wood counter, dark hair pulled into a sleek bun that somehow managed to look both professional and effortlessly chic. A knowing smirk played at the corners of her mouth, never a good sign. Traffic from the airport was murder, Savannah replied, accepting the clipboard Carmen handed her, along with her keycard. The familiar weight of organization in her hands was immediately comforting. Please tell me nobody's tried to rearrange the welcome mixer timeline while I was in transit. Your precious schedule remains intact. Carmen's fingers drummed against the counter. Though your co-host Surprise is already here and settling in. Showed up about an hour ago with enough camera equipment to film a documentary. Savannah looked up from her clipboard. Co-host Surprise? I thought we agreed I'd handle the hosting solo this year after that disaster with the lifestyle blogger who kept trying to turn every activity into sponsored content. Management had other ideas. Something about fresh energy and expanding our reach to younger demographics. Carmen's air quotes were particularly theatrical. Anyway, she's unpacking in the Hibiscus Suite. You two have that mandatory photo shoot in 20, so you might want to freshen up first. Gee. Well, that was something at least. Savannah had learned to appreciate management's commitment to keeping their Sapphic events authentically Sapphic, even if their communication skills left something to be desired. Any idea what her background is? Lifestyle, travel? Please tell me she's not one of those TikTok personalities who thinks volume equals personality. Carmen's smirk widened. Oh, you could say she's got a travel background, very experienced with wandering. Something in her tone made Savannah's radar ping, but she was already mentally shifting into logistics mode. 20 minutes meant a quick room check, maybe a shower if she was efficient. Definitely a fresh blazer. First impressions mattered, especially when she'd be working closely with someone new for an entire week. Right. I'll go get presentable and meet you both at the Heart Deck. Make sure the photographer has everything she needs. The resort's main pathways were exactly as Savannah had left them, meandering stone walkways that encouraged guests to slow down and actually notice their surroundings. She passed the main pool where early arrivals were already claiming territory, their laughter mixing with the gentle splash of water and distant steel drum music. A group of women in their 30s had commandeered the pool bar, rainbow drink stirrers catching the light as they toasted to something that involved a lot of enthusiastic squealing. The Heart Deck came into view as she rounded the corner, and she paused to do a quick visual inspection. Perfect. The fairy lights were strung exactly as she'd specified, creating an intimate canopy over the wooden platform that would photograph beautifully during sunset. White linens draped artfully from the railings, softening the structure's edges without blocking the ocean view. Even the placement of the tiki torches looked deliberately romantic rather than accidentally tropical theme park. This was her domain. These details, this atmosphere, the careful balance of structured activities and organic connection, she'd built this reputation, one successful event at a time. Whatever fresh energy management wanted to inject into the week, she'd make it work. She always did. Her room was a welcome oasis of calm after the travel chaos. Savannah hung her blazer carefully in the closet, swapped her travel flats for her good wedges, and took 30 seconds to refresh her lip gloss in the bathroom mirror. Professional but approachable, competent but not uptight. It was a balance she'd perfected over years of managing people's romantic vacation expectations. Carmen was waiting by the photographer when Savannah returned to the Heart Deck, along with a petite woman with spiky gray hair who was fussing with an impressive array of camera equipment. The late afternoon light was already shifting toward that golden hour photographers lived for. Savannah, this is Maya, our photographer. Maya, this is Savannah Reyes, our operations manager and host extraordinaire. Maya's handshake was firm, her smile genuine. Thanks for making time for this. I know photo shoots aren't exactly the fun part of event planning, but the marketing team is really excited about having both hosts in the promotional materials this year. Should create a great dynamic. Both hosts, right? Savannah straightened her shoulders and slipped into her professional persona like a comfortable jacket. Of course, where would you like us? I'm thinking we start with some casual shots by the railing, ocean backdrop, natural interaction, maybe some laughing, pointing at things. You know, like your old friends showing me around paradise. Maya gestured toward the far end of the deck where the late afternoon light was creating a particularly Instagram-worthy glow. Sounds perfect. Just let me know when you're ready for... Sorry, lost track of time. The voice came from behind the photographer's equipment. Warm honey over gravel, with that slight rasp that suggested someone who laughed often and loud. Familiar in a way that made Savannah's stomach drop 6 inches before her brain could catch up. No, absolutely not. But then she stepped into view, sun-bleached hair catching the golden light like she'd been specifically placed there by some cinematographer with a cruel sense of humor. The same easy grin that had once made Savannah forget her own name. The same loose, confident way of moving through space that suggested she belonged wherever she happened to be standing. Time didn't just stop. It stuttered, rewound, and crashed into fast-forward all at once. Lex Calderon. Her Lex. Except not hers, obviously, because people who disappeared without so much as a text message forfeited any claim to possessive pronouns. Savannah's carefully constructed composure cracked like glass hitting concrete. Her breath caught in her throat, and for one terrible moment, she was 28 again, checking her phone every 5 minutes and refreshing her email like a woman possessed. The woman who'd whispered plans for their next adventure while they'd watched the sunrise from a Barcelona balcony was standing 10 feet away, looking infuriatingly beautiful and completely at ease. Like nothing had happened, like she hadn't just vanished into thin air, leaving Savannah to wonder if their entire summer had been some elaborate fever dream. Perfect timing, Maya called out cheerfully, completely oblivious to the emotional weather system currently devastating the Heart Deck. Savannah, meet Lex, your co-host for the week. Lex, this is Savannah. I'm thinking we get you two together by the railing first, maybe some pointing and laughing like you're planning the week's activities. Pointing and laughing, right? Savannah forced her professional mask back into place, muscle memory taking over where her conscious mind had temporarily vacated the premises. She was a consummate professional. She could handle this. She moved toward the railing with rigid precision, each step carefully measured. Her spine felt like someone had replaced her vertebrae with steel rods. The words were casual, thrown away like they were meeting for coffee instead of having their first conversation in 3 years. Like Sav was still something she got to say, still something that belonged to her. The nickname hit Savannah's chest like a physical blow, carrying with it the weight of every late-night conversation, every shared laugh, every whispered promise that had apparently meant nothing. Alexandrine. The name came out, clipped, professional. Deliberately formal, she refused to use the name that felt too intimate, too loaded with memories she'd spent years methodically burying in the deep recesses of her mind. Her jaw tightened as she maintained her professional smile for Maya's camera, but she could feel her molars grinding together with the effort. Okay, beautiful. Now move a little closer together, Maya directed, eye pressed to her viewfinder. Lex, maybe put your hand on Savannah's lower back, like you're guiding her attention to something off in the distance. Before Savannah could object, she felt the warm pressure of Lex's palm against her lower back. The touch was light, casual, exactly the kind of pose Maya had requested. But the contact sent an unwelcome jolt of electricity straight through Savannah's entire nervous system. Muscle memory her body had apparently never forgotten. She remembered exactly how perfectly they'd once fit together, how Lex's hand had seemed designed specifically to rest in that exact spot on her spine. How many times had they stood like this, watching sunsets from that Barcelona balcony while Lex painted word pictures of all the places they'd go together. Savannah's professional smile felt like it might crack her face in half. From her peripheral vision, she could see Carmen watching the entire interaction with raised eyebrows and an expression of barely contained fascination. Her assistant manager was clearly picking up on the undercurrents of tension crackling between them like electrical wire in a thunderstorm, but mercifully, she kept her observations to herself. Gorgeous, the light is perfect, Maya enthused, clicking away. You two have great chemistry already. This is going to be such a fantastic week. Chemistry, right? The kind of chemistry that involved one person completely disappearing from another person's life without explanation, leaving behind nothing but read receipts and radio silence. Okay, one more like this, then we'll try a few more casual poses, Maya continued. Maybe some sitting on the railing, some walking along the deck, really capture that natural friendship energy. Natural friendship energy, if only she knew. Savannah held her pose, maintaining professional perfection while her entire body hummed with awareness of Lex's proximity. This was fine. She was fine. She'd handled difficult situations before, and she'd handle this one too. It was just 1 week. 1 week of maintaining professional courtesy with someone who'd once known her better than she knew herself. How hard could it be? Perfect. I think we've got some great shots, Maya finally announced, lowering her camera. I'll get these edited and over to marketing by tomorrow morning. The moment the photographer finished speaking, Savannah stepped away from Lex like she'd been burned. She busied herself with her clipboard, shuffling papers that didn't need shuffling, her fingers finding the familiar comfort of organization. We should review the week's schedule, she announced in her most professional voice, not quite looking at Lex directly. I'll have Carmen email you the detailed timeline and logistics breakdown. The welcome mixer starts at 6, so we'll need to be set up by 5:30 for final preparations. She needed to escape now, before her carefully maintained facade crumbled completely and she said something she couldn't take back, before she demanded explanations she wasn't sure she wanted to hear. I should go check on the bar setup and make sure the catering team has everything under control. Professional, efficient, completely in control, just like always. Even if her hands were shaking slightly as she gripped her clipboard.
Lex, Chapter 2, All Smiles, All Lies. The tremor in her hands subsided only after Savannah disappeared through the resort's main entrance, her clipboard clutched like armor against her chest. Lex waited until the click of heels on marble faded completely before finally allowing her shoulders to drop. She dug her phone from her canvas bag and walked toward the poolside bar, muscle memory kicking in as she assessed angles and lighting. Work. She needed work. Something familiar and controllable to counteract the chaos currently ricocheting around her chest. The late afternoon sun painted everything in that perfect golden hour glow that her followers lived for. She found a sturdy palm tree near the infinity pool's edge, its trunk positioned perfectly to frame the turquoise water and swaying fronds behind her. Professional autopilot took over as she adjusted her phone's angle, checking the preview screen until she caught the resort's stunning panorama in the background. Okay, Lex, you've done this 1,000 times, she murmured to herself, smoothing her sun-bleached hair and summoning her trademark smile. The one that had launched 1,000,000 likes and paid for her nomadic lifestyle. The one that never quite reached her eyes when she was pretending everything was fine. She tapped record and immediately launched into her well-rehearsed intro, her voice bright and engaging despite the knot of anxiety coiled tight in her stomach. Hey gorgeous humans, Lex here, coming to you live from the absolutely stunning Coral Bay Resort. She gestured enthusiastically at the paradise spread behind her, fighting to keep her smile radiant. And oh my god, you guys, this place is next level magical. Like, I'm talking crystal clear water, palm trees straight out of a travel magazine, and vibes that are just... She paused for dramatic effect, spreading her arms wide. Pure Caribbean bliss. Her voice maintained its usual bubbly travel blogger cadence, practiced and perfect, while her mind raced with images of hazel eyes and familiar coconut shampoo. Of the way Savannah's professional mask had slipped for exactly 2 seconds when Maya suggested they had chemistry. So this week, I'm doing something totally new and exciting, she continued, forcing herself back into performance mode. I'm co-hosting Coral Bay's very first Sapphic Singles Week. Think matchmaking meets paradise meets... Oh my gosh, is this happening right now? A whirlwind of energy and enthusiasm bounded into frame, nearly knocking Lex's phone off its precarious perch. A petite woman with short black hair and enough nervous energy to power the entire resort appeared beside her, clutching a clipboard and practically vibrating with excitement. Sorry, I'm Noelle Tran, event coordinator extraordinaire. The woman beamed at Lex's phone camera. And you must be the famous Lex Calderon. I've been following your adventures forever, that series you did in Thailand. Life-changing. Lex blinked, trying to recalibrate as Noelle continued bouncing on her toes. Oh, thank you. That's so sweet. This is Noelle, everyone, she said to the camera, attempting to incorporate the interruption seamlessly. She's the mastermind behind this entire week. Actually, speaking of the week, Noelle's eyes lit up with an idea that Lex immediately recognized as dangerous. I was just watching you two during the photo shoot, and the energy between you and Savannah? Absolutely electric. Like, I could feel the connection from across the deck. Lex's smile tightened imperceptibly. Well, we're professionals, so... Which is why, Noelle barreled on, clearly operating on her own wavelength, you need to demonstrate one of our signature matchmaking exercises for your followers. They'll eat it up and it'll give everyone a sneak peek of what this week is all about. Oh, that's really not necessary. It'll just take 5 minutes. Noelle was already tugging on Lex's arm, her enthusiasm utterly unstoppable. I already have Savannah setting up the activity pavilion. Perfect timing. Before Lex could mount any further protest, she found herself being dragged across the resort's manicured pathways, her phone hastily shoved back into her bag. The activity pavilion came into view, a large covered space with open sides that let in the ocean breeze. Colorful yoga mats and oversized beanbags were arranged in a perfect circle, and there in the center stood Savannah, adjusting cushions with military precision. Savannah looked up as they approached, and Lex caught the exact moment her professional composure faltered. Just for a heartbeat, something raw and unguarded flickered across her features before the mask snapped back into place. Noelle, I thought we were just reviewing the setup. Savannah's voice carried that carefully controlled tone Lex remembered from when she was trying very hard not to lose her temper. Change of plans, we're doing a quick demo for Lex's vlog. Isn't that brilliant? Lex caught Savannah's eye and offered what she hoped was a playful, apologetic shrug. Sorry, I think I got volunteered, she said, aiming for their old, easy humor. Want to help me commit to this accidental method acting? Savannah's hazel eyes remained frustratingly unreadable. Of course, whatever the event requires. The professional distance in those words stung more than Lex cared to admit. Perfect! Noelle clapped her hands together, seemingly oblivious to the undercurrents of tension crackling between them. Okay, so this is one of our foundational trust-building exercises. Super simple, but incredibly powerful for creating connection. She positioned them on 2 yoga mats facing each other, close enough that Lex could see the tiny gold flecks in Savannah's eyes, close enough to notice the way Savannah's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly when their knees nearly touched as they settled cross-legged on the mats. The exercise is called forehead connection, Noelle explained, pulling out her own phone to record. You'll maintain eye contact while slowly leaning forward until your foreheads touch. Hold it for 10 seconds while breathing together, then slowly separate. It's about vulnerability, trust, and presence. Lex's heart hammered against her ribs. 10 seconds with her forehead pressed against Savannah's? 10 seconds close enough to count her eyelashes? This was either the universe's idea of cosmic justice or the cruelest joke it had ever played. Ready? Noelle positioned herself behind her phone. And begin. Lex met Savannah's gaze and tried to find something soft there, some echo of the warmth that used to light up those hazel eyes when they looked at her. Instead, she found professional politeness, distant courtesy, the same expression Savannah probably wore during particularly tedious budget meetings. This feels very method actor of us, Lex whispered as they began leaning forward, hoping a gentle joke might crack through Savannah's armor. Should I be calling you darling and demanding my motivation? But Savannah's expression didn't soften. If anything, her eyes grew cooler, more remote. She was treating this like a business transaction, just another task to complete efficiently and move on from. The distance between them closed, inch by agonizing inch, until finally, inevitably, their foreheads met. The contact was gentle, barely there, but it hit Lex like a lightning strike. Savannah's skin was warm and soft, exactly like she remembered from lazy Barcelona mornings when they'd lie in bed talking about everything and nothing. The familiar scent of coconut shampoo filled her senses, and she could feel each of Savannah's careful, controlled breaths against her skin. For 10 endless seconds, they stayed frozen like that. Lex closed her eyes and let herself pretend, just for this moment, that they were 28 again and the world was full of infinite possibility, that the woman across from her still looked at her like she hung the moon, instead of like she was a mildly inconvenient work obligation. Beautiful, perfect connection. Noelle's voice seemed to come from very far away. And separate. The loss of contact was immediate and devastating. Savannah pulled back like she'd been burned, instantly rising to her feet and brushing imaginary dust off her pressed shorts. She wouldn't meet Lex's eyes, wouldn't acknowledge what had just passed between them, however one-sided it might have been. The dismissal was swift and surgical, cutting deeper than any slap could have managed. Lex covered her hurt with an exaggerated laugh, scrambling to her feet and turning to Noelle's camera. Well, there you have it, gorgeous humans. Professional chemistry at its finest. This week is going to be absolutely amazing. She caught the way Savannah's jaw tightened at the words professional chemistry, saw her carefully constructed mask slip for just a moment to reveal something that looked suspiciously like irritation. Or maybe hurt. Lex had never been good at reading Savannah when she went into full emotional lockdown mode. That was incredible, Noelle gushed, lowering her phone. The energy between you two is just wow. Our guests are going to be so inspired by your connection. Connection. Right. The kind of connection where one person refused to look at the other and treated intimate contact like they were handling contaminated equipment. I should go review the final catering arrangements, Savannah announced to no one in particular, already moving toward the pavilion's exit. The welcome mixer starts in 2 hours. She was gone before either of them could respond, leaving Lex standing among the colorful mats, feeling like she'd just been expertly dismissed from a business meeting she hadn't realized was over. She's very focused, Noelle observed, apparently taking Savannah's abrupt departure in stride. I love that about her. So professional, so on top of everything. You two are going to make such a great team this week. Lex managed another bright smile. Absolutely. I should probably go get ready too. Thanks for including me in the demo, Noelle. My followers are going to love getting that behind-the-scenes peek. She gathered her things and headed back toward the guest quarters, her professional smile dissolving the moment she was alone on the palm-lined pathway. The setting sun painted everything in soft pastels, the kind of romantic lighting that would have made her swoon in any other circumstances. Now it just felt like the universe rubbing salt in self-inflicted wounds. Her cabana was a small slice of paradise, whitewashed walls, gauzy curtains, and a private patio overlooking the ocean. Under normal circumstances, she'd be setting up her laptop to edit footage and plan tomorrow's content. Instead, she collapsed onto the king-sized bed and pulled out her phone. The message to her manager practically typed itself. "Week's going to be interesting, but I can handle it. Still planning Europe trip after this wraps." She stared at the words for a long moment, her thumb hovering over the send button. They felt hollow even as she typed them, like she was trying to convince herself as much as Renee. Part of her, a much larger part than she wanted to admit, had hoped that maybe, possibly, Savannah might be happy to see her. That 3 years might have softened the edges of whatever had gone wrong between them, that maybe they could find their way back to friendship if nothing else. Instead, she'd gotten professional courtesy and careful emotional distance, the same treatment Savannah probably gave difficult vendors or overly demanding guests. She hit send and immediately regretted it. Her phone buzzed with Renee's typically efficient response. "Good. Remember, this is brand building, not personal time. Keep things professional and think about the content opportunities. The Prague partnership depends on this going well." Lex set the phone aside and flopped back against the pillows, staring at the ceiling fan's lazy rotation. The regret that had been simmering all afternoon finally boiled over, washing through her in waves that made her chest tight and her eyes burn. She remembered their last morning in Barcelona with painful clarity. Savannah sleeping peacefully beside her, dark hair spread across the white pillowcase, morning light painting soft patterns across her bare shoulders. She'd looked so content, so trusting, so perfectly unaware that Lex was about to shatter everything beautiful they'd built together. Lex had slipped out of bed like a coward, gathered her scattered clothes in the pre-dawn darkness, and written a note she'd torn up 3 times before settling on something inadequate about needing space and figuring things out. She'd left it on the kitchen counter next to the coffee maker, knowing Savannah would find it when she woke up, expecting lazy morning kisses and plans for their last day together. She should have woken her up. Should have explained about the frantic call from her father, about her mother's unexpected surgery, about her own crushing fears of not being enough for someone as steady and amazing as Savannah. Should have trusted that the woman who'd spent 2 months showing her what love actually looked like might understand why she needed to run home and take care of her family. Instead, she'd run like she always did when things got too real, too permanent, too close to everything she was afraid of wanting. And now, here she was, 3 years later, getting exactly what she deserved. Professional politeness from the only person who'd ever made her want to stay in one place longer than a season. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent 3 years telling herself she'd made the right choice, that her nomadic lifestyle was exactly what she wanted, that freedom and adventure were worth more than stability and roots and lazy Sunday mornings with someone who actually understood her. But sitting alone in paradise, watching the sun set over water that was exactly the same color as Savannah's eyes when she was happy, Lex finally admitted what she'd been running from all along. She'd been lying to herself the entire time.
Savannah. Chapter 3. The game gets personal. The activity pavilion buzzed with nervous energy as Savannah arrived at precisely 7 o'clock, clipboard tucked against her chest like armor. A dozen retreat guests had arranged themselves on jewel-toned floor cushions in a loose circle, their conversations a mix of excited chatter and first-day jitters. She'd done this kind of icebreaker 100 times before. Pleasant, harmless, designed to ease people into the week's activities without pushing anyone too far outside their comfort zone. She positioned herself strategically across from where Lex would likely sit when she arrived, claiming a burgundy cushion that gave her the maximum possible distance while still appearing welcoming to the group. Her professional smile felt familiar and safe as she made her rounds, checking in with guests and mentally cataloging names with faces. "Everyone feeling good about tonight?" She paused beside Elena, a software engineer from Miami who looked like she was reconsidering every life choice that had led her to a singles retreat. "Just remember, We're all here for the same reason. No judgment, just connection. Elena's shoulders relaxed slightly. Thanks. I'm usually better at debugging code than talking to people. Code doesn't talk back, though, Savannah said with a genuine grin. Much safer. The sound of Lex's laughter drifted from the pavilion entrance, and Savannah's spine went rigid. She didn't turn around, couldn't afford to let her carefully constructed composure slip in front of the guests. But she could track Lex's movement through the group by the way conversations shifted and brightened. Even here, even with strangers, Lex had that magnetic pull that drew people into her orbit. Savannah checked her watch and moved toward the center of the circle as Noelle bounced through the entrance, arms full of laminated question cards and boundless enthusiasm. Good evening, beautiful souls. Noelle's voice carried that peculiar blend of yoga instructor serenity and summer camp counselor energy that somehow worked perfectly in this setting. I can feel the gorgeous energy in this space already. Are we ready to open our hearts to authentic connection? A chorus of tentative agreements rose from the group. Savannah caught sight of Lex settling onto a teal cushion directly across the circle, exactly where she'd predicted, and felt a small surge of satisfaction at her strategic positioning. They were close enough for professional collaboration, but far enough apart to avoid any accidental intimacy. Tonight's game is called First Impressions, Noelle continued, settling cross-legged in the center of the circle with the fluid grace of someone who'd probably been doing this since she was old enough to hold a tambourine. We're going to pair up and ask each other increasingly personal questions. The goal isn't to interrogate, it's to create space for vulnerability and genuine connection. Savannah relaxed slightly. She'd run this exercise dozens of times. Pleasant, controlled, easily manageable. She glanced to her left, where Maya, a soft-spoken librarian from Portland, was adjusting her wire-rimmed glasses nervously. Maya? Savannah leaned toward her with an encouraging smile. Want to partner up? I promise I'll start with the easy questions. Maya nodded gratefully, and Savannah felt her shoulders drop an inch. This would be fine. She could guide Maya through the exercise, maintain her professional demeanor, and keep a safe distance from any emotional landmines the evening might contain. Actually, Noelle's voice cut through the settling murmur of partner selection. Before we get started, I'm sensing some energy imbalances in our circle. Let me just... She began gesturing around the group like a conductor arranging an orchestra. Maya, honey, would you mind shifting over next to Priya? I think you two will have amazing synergy. And Alina, let's get you closer to Carmen. Savannah watched with growing alarm as Noelle orchestrated a complete reshuffling of the group, her peaceful evening of controlled interaction dissolving into chaos. Partners who had already introduced themselves were separated, cushions were dragged across the pavilion floor, and the careful distance Savannah had maintained evaporated with each rearrangement. And Savannah, Noelle said with the kind of bright smile that had probably convinced her wife to agree to all sorts of questionable decisions, I think you and Lex will create absolutely beautiful energy together. You're both such natural leaders. I can't wait to see what authentic connections emerge. The words hit Savannah like a rogue wave. She found herself staring directly at Lex across a suddenly intimate space, her strategic burgundy cushion now meaningless as she was guided to a navy blue mat that put them close enough to count each other's eyelashes. Lex gave her a tentative smile and a small wave, her dark eyes cautious but hopeful. The gesture was so familiar, the same uncertain optimism Lex had worn the morning they'd met at that little cafe in Barcelona, when she'd been too nervous to order in Spanish and had asked Savannah to help translate the menu. Savannah responded with a curt nod and checked her watch, silently calculating how long she needed to endure this professional torture session. 40 minutes. She could maintain her composure for 45 minutes. Perfect. Noelle clapped her hands with the enthusiasm of someone who had no idea she'd just recreated the setup for every romantic comedy Savannah had tried to forget. Now let's begin with something gentle. What's your favorite way to spend a Saturday morning? The question was innocuous enough that Savannah felt her breathing steady. She could handle favorite Saturday mornings. That was safe territory, no emotional landmines, no unexpected vulnerability. I usually start with yoga, she said, her voice professionally pleasant. Then I hit the farmer's market for fresh ingredients and spend the afternoon trying new recipes. Very domestic and predictable. She kept her answer deliberately generic, the kind of response that revealed nothing about who she actually was beneath the resort manager facade. Lex's response was softer, more contemplative. I love chasing sunrise shots on beaches that don't have names yet. There's something about being the only person awake for miles, watching the world wake up through a camera lens. Her voice grew wistful, and Savannah caught herself remembering how Lex used to set alarms for 4 a.m. just to catch the light during their Barcelona mornings. Though lately I've been wondering if I'm missing something by always being behind the camera instead of actually experiencing the moment. The admission carried a weight that made Savannah's chest tighten involuntarily. She forced herself to look down at the question cards instead of at Lex's face, where she might find emotions she wasn't prepared to process. Noelle guided the group through the progression with practiced ease. The questions escalated gradually: favorite childhood memories, biggest dreams, most embarrassing moments. Savannah maintained her carefully sanitized responses, revealing just enough personality to seem engaged, while keeping anything truly personal locked away. But Lex's answers grew increasingly genuine with each round, and despite her best efforts, Savannah found herself drawn into the stories. When asked about her biggest fear, Lex didn't give some surface-level response about spiders or public speaking. Disappointing people, she said quietly, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her shorts. Especially people who believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. I have this terrible habit of running away when things get complicated, and I'm terrified that one day I'll look around and realize I've burned every bridge that actually mattered. The honesty hit Savannah like a physical blow. She remembered how Lex used to do this: open herself up completely, trust that whoever was listening would handle her vulnerability with care. It had been one of the things that had drawn Savannah to her in the first place, this fearless authenticity that made intimacy feel effortless. When the crying question came up, Lex admitted to tearing up during a documentary about sea turtle conservation the week before. Stupid, right? But watching those baby turtles struggle toward the ocean and knowing how many of them would make it. She shrugged, but her eyes were bright with unshed tears. Sometimes the world feels too beautiful and too fragile at the same time. Savannah caught herself leaning forward, hanging on every word the way she used to when Lex would describe her latest photography project, the way Lex's whole face would light up when she talked about capturing authentic moments, the passionate intensity that made even mundane subjects sound fascinating through her perspective. She straightened immediately, creating physical distance to match the emotional walls she was desperately trying to maintain. The circle had grown quieter as the questions became more intimate, conversations becoming whispered exchanges instead of group sharing. Savannah could feel the other guests watching her and Lex with increasing interest, their body language and careful responses clearly indicating some kind of unresolved history. They were performing their tension for an audience and everyone knew it. When Noelle read the next question, her voice carried across the pavilion with theatrical flair. What's your biggest regret? The words hung in the air like a live grenade. Savannah's palms began to sweat as Lex's eyes locked onto hers for a charged moment. Around them, other conversations continued, but the space between their mats felt isolated, pressurized. Lex spoke quietly, but her words carried clearly across their intimate distance. Not fighting harder for something I wanted, letting fear make decisions for me instead of trusting that some things are worth the risk. Savannah's chest tightened with unwanted recognition. The careful phrasing could have been about anything: a job opportunity, a dream deferred, a creative project abandoned. But the intensity in Lex's gaze made it impossible to pretend she was talking about anything other than them. The moment stretched until Savannah had to respond, had to offer something in return. She could feel the weight of expectation from the group, the natural rhythm of the exercise demanding reciprocal vulnerability. I regret trusting too easily, she said, her voice steadier than she felt, believing that people meant what they said instead of watching what they actually did. It was honest enough to satisfy the exercise, but vague enough to avoid giving Lex any ammunition. Professional-grade vulnerability, just enough to seem engaged without revealing anything that could be used against her later. Lex's face fell slightly, but she nodded with the kind of resigned understanding that suggested she'd gotten the message loud and clear. Noelle shuffled through her remaining cards with building anticipation, clearly saving the best for last. When she read the final question, her voice carried the dramatic weight of someone who lived for these moments of manufactured emotional intensity. Who was your first love and what did they teach you about yourself? The question landed in their circle like a bomb detonating in slow motion. Savannah felt her throat constrict and her carefully maintained composure threatening to crack along every seam she'd spent 3 years reinforcing. Around them, the other pairs shifted uncomfortably. Some guests looked relieved they'd been spared this particular emotional grenade, while others leaned in with the kind of anticipation usually reserved for reality television drama. Lex went first, her voice soft but carrying clearly across the suddenly silent pavilion. Every conversation had stopped. Every pair had turned their attention to this moment, sensing something significant about to unfold. He taught me that home isn't a place, it's a person, Lex said, her eyes never leaving Savannah's face, and that sometimes you don't realize what you have until you've already lost it, that safety and adventure aren't opposites. They're what happens when you find someone brave enough to build something beautiful with you. The words were a love letter delivered as autobiography, a confession disguised as a general answer. Every syllable was aimed directly at Savannah, crafted to slip past her defenses and lodge somewhere deeper than professional courtesy could reach. All eyes turned to Savannah, waiting. The silence stretched until it became uncomfortable, then unbearable. She could feel her throat constricting, her palms sweating, her carefully maintained composure cracking under the weight of a dozen curious stares and one desperate, hopeful gaze. She forced a brittle laugh that sounded fake even to her own ears. First love, I try not to dwell on ancient history. Some lessons are better left in the past where they belong. The words came out sharper than she'd intended, landing like a slap across the intimate space between them. Lex's face went carefully blank, the hopeful vulnerability disappearing behind a mask of professional neutrality that Savannah recognized, because she'd perfected the same technique herself. The circle erupted into uncomfortable murmurs and sudden interest in water bottles and sandal adjustments. Noelle, for once, seemed at a loss for words, her usual boundless enthusiasm dampened by the emotional wreckage she'd inadvertently orchestrated. Savannah had effectively slammed the door on the moment, leaving no room for interpretation or hope. It was brutal and efficient and exactly what she'd intended. So why did she feel like she was the one who'd been wounded?
Lex. Chapter 4, Sunset and Static. The humiliation hit like a physical blow, spreading heat across Lex's chest and up her neck in waves that felt almost feverish. Her skin prickled with the sensation of being watched, dissected, found wanting by an audience she couldn't bear to face. She couldn't sit here another second, surrounded by pitying glances and the awkward silence that followed emotional carnage like the aftermath of a particularly brutal storm, without looking at anyone, especially not at Savannah, whose hazel eyes she could feel boring into her with what felt like clinical detachment. She pushed herself up from the mat and walked quickly toward the pavilion's exit. "Lex, wait!" Noelle's voice followed her, bright with concern and confusion, but Lex pretended not to hear it. She needed distance. She needed air. She needed to be anywhere but here, where she'd just laid her heart bare only to watch Savannah stomp on it with surgical precision, each word delivered with the kind of careful control that made rejection feel like an art form. Her feet found the narrow trail that wound into the jungle almost automatically, muscle memory from her brief exploration yesterday guiding her when conscious thought felt impossible. She'd spotted it during her arrival tour, a promising path that disappeared into green shadows and seemed to promise the kind of solitude she specialized in seeking when things got complicated. Right now, solitude felt like the only thing that might save what was left of her dignity. The activity pavilion's chatter faded behind her as she pushed deeper into the tropical foliage, each step taking her further from the scene of her spectacular miscalculation. Massive palm fronds created a dense canopy overhead, their rustling whispers providing a soundtrack to her retreat as they filtered the afternoon sunlight into dancing patterns of gold and green that played across the packed earth path like shifting kaleidoscope fragments. Flowering vines draped between trees like nature's streamers, their sweet fragrance heavy in the humid air that clung to her skin with tropical insistence. Under different circumstances, she might have stopped to photograph the way light caught on a bird of paradise bloom, or how moss crept up the base of an ancient banyan tree in emerald spirals that spoke of years of patient growth. Instead, she focused on breathing, each inhale bringing the earthy scent of decomposing leaves and rich soil, in through her nose, out through her mouth, trying to ease the tight band around her chest that made each breath feel insufficient, like she was drowning in humidity and her own mortification. The sound of her sandals against packed dirt provided a steady rhythm that helped ground her, each step carrying her further from the scene of her spectacular emotional miscalculation and deeper into the green embrace of anonymity. In history, the words echoed in her head with the precision of a well-aimed dart, Savannah's voice delivering them with the kind of finality that left no room for interpretation. She had made it crystal clear where Lex stood, or rather, where she didn't stand. Firmly in the past, apparently, where some lessons were better left buried under layers of professional courtesy and carefully maintained distance. The message couldn't have been clearer if Savannah had taken out a billboard along the resort's main drag. She should have seen it coming, should have read the signs in every clipped response, every professional smile that never quite reached those gorgeous hazel eyes, every careful maintenance of physical distance that spoke of boundaries drawn in permanent ink. But she'd let hope cloud her judgment, mistaking Savannah's forced politeness for possibility, reading invitation in what was clearly just good customer service. Classic Lex, jumping headfirst into emotional rapids without checking the depth first, assuming the current would carry her somewhere safe instead of dashing her against the rocks. The trail curved sharply to the left through a grove of bamboo that creaked and swayed in the ocean breeze, then opened into a small clearing where she could hear the distant sound of waves rolling against shore with hypnotic persistence. She pushed through a curtain of hanging vines that brushed against her sun-warmed skin like gentle fingers and stepped onto a crescent-shaped beach that looked like something from a postcard someone might send to make their friends jealous. Smooth stones lined the water's edge, polished by countless tides into perfect ovals that gleamed wet in the golden light, where gentle waves lapped with the kind of regularity that usually soothed her restless spirit. A piece of weathered driftwood sat perfectly positioned for viewing the ocean, silvered by salt and sun into the kind of natural sculpture that spoke of decades spent surrendering to the sea's patient reshaping, as if nature had arranged it specifically for moments like this, when someone needed a place to sit and contemplate their romantic failures in appropriately dramatic surroundings. Lex settled onto the driftwood, its sun-warmed surface still holding the day's heat against her bare thighs, and pulled out her camera with hands that trembled only slightly. The familiar weight of it provided an anchor, something solid and controllable when everything else felt like it was shifting beneath her feet. Photography had always been her processing mechanism, the way she made sense of emotions too complex for words, turning chaos into composition and heartbreak into art worth sharing with strangers who understood the language of filtered light and carefully framed moments. She adjusted the aperture settings without any particular goal in mind, her fingers moving through the familiar motions of capstops and shutter speeds with the kind of muscle memory that came from years of seeking beauty in difficult places. The mechanical precision occupied the part of her brain that wanted to replay every mortifying second of the last 20 minutes, giving her hands something productive to do while her heart struggled to make sense of what had just happened. Through the viewfinder, she could see the sun beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the water in broad strokes of gold and amber that would look stunning in photos, the kind of shot that would make her followers sigh with envy and ask about location tags. But her heart wasn't in it. The usual thrill of capturing perfect light feeling as distant as the horizon itself. Even the most beautiful sunset felt hollow when you had no one to share it with, when the person you wanted most to show it to had just made it clear that sharing moments like this was ancient history. The sound of footsteps on the trail made her look up, expecting to see one of the other guests who'd wandered off to explore. Instead, Savannah emerged from the green canopy looking flustered and slightly out of breath, her always perfect ponytail showing signs of humidity, and her professional composure finally cracked around the edges. They stared at each other across the small beach, the only sounds the gentle rhythm of waves lapping against coral sand and the distant calls of tropical birds settling into their evening roosts. Lex could see the conflict playing across Savannah's face, the same war between fight and flight that had been there all day, but more visible now, without an audience to perform for. The professional mask had finally slipped, revealing the exhaustion beneath, the raw uncertainty that made her look younger and infinitely more fragile than the competent resort manager who'd been fielding guest complaints and logistical disasters all afternoon. She remained standing near the trail entrance, her weight shifted slightly onto her back foot, poised as if ready to disappear back into the jungle at the first sign of trouble. The woman said I needed air, Savannah said finally, her voice quieter than it had been all day. The words came out rough around the edges, like she'd been holding her breath too long. Her arms were crossed defensively across her chest, fingers gripping her own elbows in a way that made the gesture look less like attitude and more like she was holding herself together. It was a barrier that looked both protective and isolating. The same pose Lex remembered from that last morning 7 years ago when everything had started falling apart. Lex set down her camera carefully on the driftwood beside her, the familiar weight of it leaving her hands feeling strangely empty. She gestured to the space next to her on the sun-warmed wood, the gesture as gentle as she could make it. "There's room," she offered softly, trying to keep any trace of expectation or pressure out of her voice. She'd already pushed too hard once today, had seen the way Savannah's walls had slammed back up the moment things got too real. To her surprise, Savannah actually moved closer, her bare feet silent against the cooling sand. She settled onto the driftwood with careful precision, though she left deliberate space between them, enough distance to avoid accidental contact, but not so much that it felt hostile. The gap was maybe 8 inches, close enough that Lex could catch the faint scent of Savannah's coconut sunscreen, mixed with something distinctly her, something that made Lex's chest tight with recognition. It was progress, maybe, or maybe it was just exhaustion finally winning out over pride. They sat in surprisingly comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the sun continue its descent toward the horizon. The light kept changing, shifting from bright gold to deeper amber as the day slowly surrendered to evening. Lex found herself stealing glances at Savannah's profile, memorizing details she thought she'd forgotten. The familiar curve of her jaw, the way she unconsciously tucked a strand of hair behind her ear when she was thinking, the slight crease between her eyebrows that appeared whenever she was processing something complex. "I wasn't trying to embarrass you back there," Lex said quietly, her fingers tracing aimless patterns in the sand near her feet. The words came out more vulnerable than she'd intended, but the privacy of the cove made honesty feel safer somehow. "I just thought maybe we could—" She stopped herself before finishing the sentence, unsure what she'd been hoping for. That they could pretend the last 3 years hadn't happened, that they could pick up where they'd left off. That Savannah might look at her the way she used to, like Lex was someone worth staying for. "You always did say too much," Savannah responded, her voice barely above a whisper. But there was no real bite in it this time, just exhaustion, and for a moment the old intimacy flickered between them like candlelight in a gentle breeze. It was the first thing she'd said all day that sounded like the Savannah Lex remembered. Direct, but not cruel. Honest, without being devastating. Encouraged by the softness in her voice, Lex turned to face her more fully. This might be her only chance to explain, to give context to the choice that had clearly wounded them both. The words she'd been carrying for 3 years pressed against her ribs, demanding release. About Barcelona, about why I left without— "Don't!" Savannah's voice cut through the humid air like a knife, and she stood up abruptly, the spell breaking so completely that Lex could almost hear it shatter. Her walls slammed back into place with the efficiency of someone who'd had plenty of practice, protecting herself from unwanted truths. She stepped back toward the trail, putting both physical and emotional distance between them. "Whatever you're about to say, I don't need to hear it. Some things are better left buried." The words landed with finality, echoing her earlier dismissal but more personal this time, more raw. Lex watched helplessly as the woman she'd never stopped loving turned and walked back toward the jungle path, leaving her sitting alone on the driftwood, with the waves and the dying light and the crushing weight of all the words she'd never gotten to say. The evening breeze picked up, carrying the salt scent of the ocean and the sweet fragrance of night-blooming jasmine. In the distance, she could hear the faint sounds of the resort coming back to life after the afternoon activities. Laughter from the pool, the gentle clink of glassware from the beachside bar, the soft strumming of a guitar from somewhere near the main deck. Lex picked up her camera again and pointed it toward the sunset, but her hands were shaking too much to hold it steady. Through the viewfinder, the horizon blurred into watercolor streaks of orange and pink that might have been beautiful if she could focus on anything other than the hollow ache in her chest. She had thought coming here would give her a chance to explain, to apologize, to maybe find some kind of closure if nothing else. Instead, she'd managed to make things worse, to push Savannah further away than ever. 3 years of wondering what might have been, and apparently the answer was nothing. Ancient history was exactly what it sounded like, something that belonged in the past, buried and forgotten. The camera felt heavy in her hands, weighted with all the photos she'd never taken of the life they might have built together. She lowered it to her lap and let herself sit with the disappointment, with the sharp edge of rejection that cut deeper than any professional setback ever could. Tomorrow she'd have to paste on her influencer smile and pretend everything was fine, that this week was just another fun collaboration with an old friend. She'd have to be charming and flirty and carefree for the cameras while her heart felt like it was held together with tape and wishful thinking. But right now, she could let herself feel it. The regret, the longing, the terrible certainty that she'd lost something irreplaceable and there was no getting it back. The waves kept their steady rhythm against the shore, indifferent to human heartbreak, marking time with the kind of patience that only nature possessed.
Savannah, Chapter 5, Rum and Real Talk. The poolside mixer had wound down with the efficiency of a well-rehearsed dance. Guests filtered back to their rooms in clusters, trailing conversations about tomorrow's activities and leaving behind a scatter of empty cocktail glasses and the lingering scent of frangipani from the centerpieces. The tiki torches flickered in their holders, casting warm shadows across the deck, where just hours ago, Savannah had been forcing smiles and pretending her world hadn't tilted sideways. She remained anchored to her bar stool, nursing what had to be her third rum punch, or was it her fourth? The fruity sweetness had long since stopped masking the burn of alcohol, but it was doing a decent job of blunting the sharp edges of her thoughts. Around her, Carmen moved with practiced efficiency, stacking chairs and clearing tables with the quiet competence that had made her indispensable over the past 5 years. "Leave it," Savannah called out as Carmen reached for another abandoned glass. "The night crew can handle the rest." Carmen paused, glancing at her watch, nearly 10:30, then methodically finished gathering the cocktail napkins scattered across one table before making her way over to the bar. The soft padding of her canvas sneakers against the polished concrete floor was barely audible over the distant crash of waves and the muted hum of the industrial dishwashers in the kitchen. She slid onto the stool next to Savannah with the fluid motion of someone who knew exactly how these conversations went, her movements economical and purposeful as she reached behind the bar to pour herself a club soda from the gun. The carbonated water hissed softly as it hit the glass, a sharp contrast to the thick, humid air that had settled over the resort like a damp blanket. The silence stretched between them, comfortable in the way that only came from years of working together through resort crises, demanding guests, and Savannah's own carefully orchestrated emotional evasions. Carmen sipped her drink, the ice clinking against the glass in a steady rhythm that somehow managed to sound both casual and expectant. She studied Savannah with dark eyes that missed absolutely nothing. Not the slight tremor in her hands as she lifted her glass, not the way she'd been avoiding eye contact all evening like a teenager caught sneaking out past curfew. Not the fact that she'd ordered her drinks with extra rum and hadn't touched the slice of pineapple garnish that usually disappeared first. "So," Carmen said finally, swirling ice in her glass with deliberate casualness, the sound like small stones rolling against the sides. Her voice carried the particular brand of patience that came from knowing when to wait and when to push. "Want to tell me why you looked like you'd seen a ghost during the welcome photos? Or are we pretending everything's normal?" Savannah took a long sip of her drink, feeling the rum burn slightly as it went down her throat and settled warm in her chest. She'd been dreading this conversation all day, knowing Carmen would eventually corner her somewhere private and demand answers with the relentless persistence of a detective who'd already solved the case. Her assistant had a talent for reading between the lines that bordered on supernatural, and Savannah's poker face had apparently been more transparent than a sheet of resort-branded tissue paper. The realization sat heavy in her stomach, mixing unpleasantly with the alcohol and the lingering taste of artificial fruit. "Just surprised by the last-minute co-host addition," she said, giving Carmen her standard deflection, with the same tone she used for difficult guests. "You know how I like to be prepared." Carmen snorted softly, a sound that managed to convey both amusement and skepticism in equal measure. She raised one perfectly shaped eyebrow and fixed Savannah with the kind of look that had cowed overprivileged resort guests into compliance. "Right, because you always get that particular shade of pale when someone messes with your spreadsheets." She leaned forward slightly, her voice gentling in a way that was somehow more dangerous than her earlier sarcasm. "I've never seen you react to anyone like that, Sav. Not in 5 years. Not even when that tech billionaire tried to buy his way into your room during Pride Week." The memory of that particular incident would have made Savannah smile under normal circumstances. Carmen had handled the situation with the kind of creative problem-solving that bordered on art. But tonight, the reminder of her usually unshakable composure only highlighted how thoroughly Lex's presence had rattled her. "It's ancient history," she insisted, but even she could hear how unconvincing her voice sounded. She traced the rim of her glass with one finger, focusing on the smooth curve of glass rather than Carmen's penetrating stare. Her carefully constructed walls, the ones that had protected her through 3 years of building a career and a life that didn't require anyone else's approval, felt like they were beginning to wobble. Carmen watched her for a long moment, the kind of patient observation that made Savannah feel like she was being cataloged and filed away for future reference. When she spoke again, her voice was quiet but carried the weight of someone who'd seen enough of life to ask the hard questions. What if she didn't leave because she didn't care? What if it was the opposite? The question hit Savannah like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs and making her grip tighten around her glass. It was the possibility she'd spent 3 years actively avoiding, the what if that lived in the dark corners of her mind where she kept all the thoughts too dangerous to examine in daylight. She laughed, but the sound came out bitter and sharp-edged, nothing like the genuine laughter Lex used to coax out of her during long Barcelona afternoons. "People who care don't just disappear, Carmen. They don't pack up and vanish without a word, leaving you to wonder what you did wrong for 3 fucking years." The profanity felt good, like releasing pressure from a valve that had been sealed too tight for too long. She rarely swore in front of staff, maintaining the kind of professional composure that came naturally after years of hospitality training. But Carmen had stopped being just staff somewhere around year 2, when she'd stayed up all night helping Savannah manage a hurricane evacuation without being asked. "Maybe," Carmen said thoughtfully, draining the last of her club soda and setting the glass down with a soft clink. "But people also do stupid things when they're scared, or hurt, or protecting someone they love." She squeezed Savannah's shoulder, a brief touch that managed to convey both sympathy and challenge before slipping off her bar stool and heading toward the main building. Her sandals made soft slapping sounds against the tile as she walked away, leaving Savannah alone with that devastating possibility echoing in her head like a song she couldn't stop humming. Protecting someone they love. The words settled into her chest like stones, heavy and uncomfortable and impossible to ignore. She'd never considered that angle, had never allowed herself to examine Lex's departure through any lens except abandonment and rejection. It was easier to be angry than to be curious, safer to build walls than to wonder if there might have been reasons beyond her own inadequacy. Savannah sat at the empty bar for another 20 minutes, watching the last of the tiki torches burn down while the resort settled into its nighttime rhythm around her. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the night security guard making his rounds, his radio crackling softly as he checked in with the front desk. A couple laughed as they made their way back to their room, their voices growing fainter as they followed the winding path toward the guest. Finally, she abandoned her drink, still half full and now warm enough to be unpalatable, and made her way down the wooden steps that led from the pool deck to the beach. The sand was cool beneath her bare feet, a relief after the day's heat that had soaked into every surface of the resort. She'd kicked off her sandals somewhere between her second and third drink, and now she carried them dangling from one hand as she walked toward the water's edge. The beach stretched empty in both directions, illuminated by the soft glow of solar lights embedded in the driftwood markers that lined the walking path. Despite the late hour, she could hear distant laughter carrying on the warm night breeze from other guests' rooms. People who were presumably having the kind of carefree vacation experience she was supposed to be facilitating. She felt suddenly disconnected from her own life, like she was watching someone else's story unfold from the outside. This morning, she'd been Savannah Reyes, competent resort operations manager with a flawless track record and a 5-year plan that didn't include emotional complications. Now she was just someone standing on a beach in the dark, questioning everything she'd believed about the most important relationship of her adult life. The waves lapped against the shore with hypnotic regularity, each one carrying away a layer of sand and leaving the beach subtly changed. She found herself matching her breathing to their rhythm, letting the sound wash over her like a meditation she'd never learned, but somehow understood instinctively. Despite her best efforts to maintain the anger that had sustained her for 3 years, Savannah found her mind drifting backward. Not to the devastating morning when she'd woken up alone in their Barcelona apartment, but to the weeks before that. To mornings when Lex would sleep curled against her side, one arm thrown possessively across her waist, like she was afraid Savannah might disappear in the night. To whispered conversations about places they wanted to travel together, adventures they'd never take. She'd always been the planner in their relationship, the one who researched restaurants and booked museums and kept track of train schedules. But Lex had been the dreamer, spinning elaborate fantasies about renting a villa in Tuscany or learning to surf in Costa Rica or spending a month in Thailand eating nothing but street food. Savannah had pretended to be practical about these plans, pointing out budget constraints and visa requirements, but secretly she'd been cataloging every suggestion in her mental file of future possibilities. For the first time in 3 years, she allowed herself to wonder if maybe, just maybe, she'd never known the whole story. If Carmen was right about people doing stupid things when they were scared. If there had been something Lex couldn't tell her, some reason that had nothing to do with Savannah not being enough. The possibility felt dangerous, like touching a bruise she'd spent years learning to avoid. It would be so much easier to maintain the narrative she'd constructed, that Lex was fundamentally unreliable, that their summer had been nothing more than a vacation fling that had run its natural course. That story had sharp edges but clean lines, and it didn't require her to examine her own role in what had gone wrong. But Carmen's words kept echoing in her head, mixing with the sound of waves and the memory of Lex's expression that afternoon during the trail walk. There had been something in her eyes when she'd started to explain about Barcelona, something that looked less like casual indifference and more like old regret, the kind of regret that didn't fade with time but lived in the spaces between words, waiting for someone brave enough to ask the right questions. Savannah walked along the water's edge until she reached the far end of the resort's private beach, where a collection of sea grape trees created a natural boundary between their property and the public coastline. The night air was thick with humidity and the competing fragrances of salt water and night-blooming jasmine, creating the kind of sensory overload that made everything feel slightly unreal. She chose a piece of driftwood that had been polished smooth by years of tide and settled onto it like it was the most natural thing in the world to be sitting alone on a beach at nearly midnight, wearing a wrinkled linen shirt and questioning every assumption she'd made about her own love story. The alcohol had left her feeling loose, limbed, and philosophical in a way that would probably embarrass her tomorrow, but right now it felt like permission to examine thoughts she'd kept locked away. What if Lex hadn't left because she'd gotten bored? What if there had been something else? A family emergency, a personal crisis, some obligation that had nothing to do with Savannah's worthiness as a partner. The questions felt like opening a door she'd kept deliberately sealed, letting light into a room she'd assumed was empty. The worst part was how easily she could picture alternative scenarios now that Carmen had planted the seed. Lex receiving a phone call in the middle of the night, making impossible choices with no good options. Lex trying to protect her from something messy and complicated, the way she'd always tried to shield Savannah from her own more chaotic impulses. Lex leaving not because she didn't care, but because she cared too much to drag Savannah into whatever crisis required her immediate departure. It was possible. That was the thing that made her chest tight, with something that might have been hope or might have been terror. It was entirely possible that she'd spent 3 years being angry at the wrong person for the wrong reasons.
Lex, Chapter 6, Snap Judgments. Lex dragged her hands through her hair one more time, checking her reflection in the activity pavilion's glass doors before stepping inside to face the music. She'd spent the better part of an hour that morning mentally preparing for this, The photography challenge she'd pitched 3 months ago when this gig had seemed like easy money and a tropical vacation rolled into one. Now, with Savannah stationed at the back of the room like a professionally dressed sentinel, it felt more like walking into emotional quicksand. "Good morning, beautiful humans!" She cranked up her influencer voice to 11, gesturing toward the collection of cameras, tripods, and props they'd arranged on folding tables. "Who's ready to capture some magic?" The enthusiasm from the group was immediate and infectious. Exactly the kind of energy that usually recharged her creative batteries. Indy Munro practically vibrated in the front row, phone already out and recording, while a handful of other guests clutched various devices ranging from expensive DSLRs to basic point-and-shoots. Everyone looked eager, sun-kissed, and ready for whatever artistic adventure she could conjure up. "So here's the thing about photography," Lex continued, picking up her favorite camera. A well-loved Canon that had been with her through 4 continents and countless adventures. "Everyone thinks it's about having the fanciest equipment, but honestly, some of my most popular posts were shot on a beat-up film camera I bought at a Barcelona flea market for 20 euros. She caught herself mentioning Barcelona and felt heat creep up her neck. Of course, that would be the example her brain served up. But when she risked a glance toward the back of the pavilion, Savannah's expression remained neutral, clipboard poised and professional mask firmly in place. "The secret," Lex said, forcing herself to focus on the eager faces in front of her, "is understanding light and composition. Your camera, whether it's a phone or a professional setup, is just a tool for capturing what you already see." She moved toward the pavilion's edge, where someone had obviously put serious thought into creating an Instagram-worthy backdrop. Flowering vines cascaded from the support beams, their purple blooms catching the morning light in a way that would make any photographer's heart race. Palm fronds swayed gently in the breeze, creating natural frames and shadows that shifted like living art. "See how the light filters through these leaves?" Lex adjusted her position, demonstrating different angles while the group gathered around. "It's creating this gorgeous, dappled effect, soft enough to be flattering, but with enough contrast to add drama." She was in her element now, muscle memory taking over as she explained the rule of thirds and the importance of finding unique perspectives. This part had always come naturally to her, the technical knowledge married to an intuitive understanding of what made images compelling. Her followers might think she was all spontaneous wanderlust and lucky timing, but the truth was that she'd spent years studying light and composition with the dedication of someone who'd turned wandering into a legitimate career. "The key is to stop thinking like a tourist and start thinking like a storyteller," she said, crouching to frame a shot of the trailing flowers against the backdrop of blue sky. "What feeling are you trying to capture? What story does this moment tell?" When she looked up, she caught Savannah watching with an expression that looked almost like interest. For a split second, the professional mask had slipped, revealing something that reminded Lex of quiet afternoons on their Barcelona balcony. Teaching Savannah to load film into her ancient camera, their heads bent close together as she explained exposure settings and depth of field, the way Savannah had bitten her lip in concentration, how her face had lit up when she'd nailed a particularly tricky shot. The memory hit with enough force to make Lex's hands shake slightly around her camera. 3 years later, and she could still remember exactly how Savannah had looked through that viewfinder. Serious and focused and absolutely beautiful. "Oh my God, you guys!" Indy's voice cut through the moment like a rusty knife. "This is perfect! The hosts should totally demonstrate some real chemistry for everyone." Lex blinked, refocusing on the present as Indy bounced toward her with the kind of manic enthusiasm that probably made for great content but terrible timing. The other guests were already murmuring approval, phones coming out as they sensed potential drama. "I mean, you're both gorgeous," Indy continued, apparently oblivious to the tension radiating from the back of the pavilion. "And everyone knows the best photos happen when there's actual connection between the subjects. You should totally model for each other." The suggestion landed in the pavilion like a small bomb. Lex felt every muscle in her body tense as she waited for Savannah to shut this down with professional efficiency and probably a side of barely concealed irritation. But when she turned toward the back of the room, Savannah's expression was doing something complicated, a flash of what looked like panic, quickly covered by forced brightness that didn't quite reach her eyes. "That's..." Savannah cleared her throat, straightening her shoulders in that way Lex recognized as her preparing for battle. That sounds like a great learning opportunity for everyone. The words came out just slightly too loud, like someone trying to convince herself as much as her audience. Lex felt something twist in her chest. Part relief that Savannah wasn't going to make this weird, part concern about the cost of that forced cooperation. Perfect! Indy clapped her hands together, already framing potential shots with her fingers. This is going to be so authentic. Lex caught Savannah's eye and offered what she hoped was a reassuring smile. How about we start at the heart deck? The morning light should be perfect for some candid interaction shots. Savannah nodded, clutching her clipboard like a shield as the group began to migrate toward the romantic overlook platform. They fell into step beside each other, the silence between them feeling heavier than it should have given that they were surrounded by chattering guests armed with cameras. "You don't have to do this," Lex said quietly as they followed the palm-lined path toward the deck. "I can make some excuse about equipment issues or—" "It's fine." The response was quick and sharp enough to suggest it was anything but fine. "It's just photography." They walked a few more steps in loaded silence before Lex spotted a bird of a paradise flower blooming beside the path. The orange and blue petals caught the light like something out of a tropical fantasy, and she found herself stopping automatically. "Look at how that light hits the petals," she said, partly because the sight genuinely caught her photographer's eye, partly because she was desperate to fill the awkward quiet. The way it brings out those blue highlights, that's the kind of natural lighting you can't fake. Savannah glanced at the bloom, her expression softening slightly. "The landscaping crew replanted this whole section last month. They said the old plants weren't photogenic enough for the resort's social media." There was something almost fond in her voice when she talked about the staff, like she was proud of their attention to detail. Lex filed that observation away, another small piece of the person Savannah had become in their years apart. The heart deck stretched before them like something out of a wedding magazine. Fairy lights strung between posts, draped linens fluttering in the breeze, and a backdrop of endless blue ocean that would make any photographer weep with joy. The platform was already occupied by a few early morning guests with coffee cups, but they quickly cleared out when they spotted the incoming photography lesson. "Okay," Lex said, trying to channel her professional confidence as she handed Savannah her camera. "Why don't you be the photographer first? I'll be the guinea pig." She positioned herself against the deck railing, the ocean breeze catching her hair and the morning sun warming her shoulders. But instead of striking some influencer pose, she found herself slipping into teacher mode, the same way she used to when she was helping Savannah understand her old film camera. The key with backlighting like this is balancing your exposure," she said, gesturing toward the bright sky behind her. "If you expose for my face, the background will blow out. If you expose for the background, I'll be too dark. So you want to find that sweet spot where—" She stopped talking when she realized Savannah had lifted the camera and was looking at her through the viewfinder. There was something in that posture, the way Savannah adjusted her stance and tilted her head slightly, that made Lex's heart do something complicated. Muscle memory, maybe. Or the way Savannah's expression had gone soft and focused in exactly the same way it used to when she was concentrating on getting a shot just right. The camera clicked several times in quick succession, and Lex found herself relaxing into the moment despite the audience of guests gathering around them with their own devices. There was something soothing about being on the other side of the lens for once, letting someone else worry about composition and timing, while she just existed in the space between one breath and the next. "You still remember," she said softly, when Savannah lowered the camera. The words hung between them, weighted with more meaning than photography technique. Savannah's cheeks flushed pink, but she didn't deny it or deflect with sarcasm the way Lex had been expecting. "The poolside area might give us different lighting," Savannah said instead, already turning toward the next location. "More direct sun, less atmospheric." They moved around the resort like that, their conversation gradually finding an easier rhythm as Savannah's eye for composition became more apparent and Lex offered gentle corrections about technical settings. It was dangerous how natural it felt, this collaboration that had once been second nature to them. The way Savannah anticipated what Lex was going to suggest before she said it, how Lex knew exactly which angles would appeal to Savannah's preference for clean, symmetrical shots. Near the entrance to the Cove Trail, Lex paused to adjust a drooping vine that was blocking part of their makeshift backdrop. The gesture was automatic, the kind of small perfectionism that came from years of setting up shots in less than ideal conditions. You know, Savannah said, watching her fuss with the foliage, most tourists would just accept the droopy vine as authentic tropical ambiance and call it artistic. The dry observation made Lex laugh, a real laugh, not the performed version she trotted out for cameras. God, you're right. I've turned into one of those people who can't leave anything alone. Next, I'll be carrying a spray bottle to keep the leaves shiny. The spray bottle is actually not a bad idea, Savannah said, and there was something almost playful in her voice. Though, knowing resort guests, they'd probably think you were trying to create some kind of weird misting experience. Lex was still laughing at the mental image when she heard the camera click. The sound made her turn, and she found Savannah looking at the camera's display with an expression that was difficult to read. "Let me see," Lex said, moving close enough to peer over Savannah's shoulder at the small screen. The photo stopped her cold. It was her, mid-laugh, face open and bright in a way that looked exactly like the woman she'd been 3 years ago in Barcelona. Before the complicated ending and the careful spaces they'd learned to maintain around each other. Before she'd become someone who performed her emotions more often than she felt them. The image was beautiful, technically excellent, and emotionally honest in a way that made something ache deep in her chest. But more than that, it was proof of how Savannah had looked at her in that unguarded moment, through the lens of someone who still remembered what it felt like to find her beautiful. They stood there in loaded silence, both staring at evidence of something neither of them were ready to name. The sounds of the resort continued around them, distant laughter from the pool, the rustle of palm fronds overhead, the ever-present whisper of waves against the shore, but it all felt muted compared to the weight of what sat between them on that small screen. Savannah's voice came out rough, and she cleared her throat before trying again. I should check on the other guests, make sure they're not getting too frustrated with the technical stuff. She handed the camera back with the kind of careful speed that suggested she was trying not to touch Lex's fingers in the process, but Lex caught her wrist gently before she could retreat completely. I really do need to check on everyone, Savannah said, not quite meeting her eyes. Professional responsibility and all that. Lex let her go, watching as Savannah walked back toward the activity pavilion with the measured pace of someone trying very hard not to look like she was fleeing. She stood there for a long moment after Savannah disappeared around a bend in the path, clutching her camera and staring at the photo that proved Savannah still looked at her like she was worth capturing. For the first time since she'd stepped off the boat 3 days ago, Lex allowed herself to hope that maybe the story between them wasn't quite finished after all.
Savannah, Chapter 7, Room 214. The first drops hit the heart deck like a warning shot. Fat, warm splashes that sent the paper lanterns swaying and made the guests look up with mild curiosity. Savannah was adjusting the height of the tiki torches when the sky opened up completely, transforming curiosity into chaos in the span of 10 seconds. "Everyone inside," she called, but her voice was already being swallowed by the sound of rain hammering the wooden deck and the surprised shrieks of 30 women in cocktail attire scrambling for the nearest covered pavilion. The wind picked up, sending cocktail napkins flying like confetti and toppling half-empty glasses with crystalline crashes that rang out against the thunder. Savannah rushed toward the bar setup, her sensible flats slipping on the already slick deck as she tried to salvage what she could. Rain soaked through her linen blazer, the good one she'd pressed this morning specifically for tonight's mixer, and turned her carefully arranged updo into a sodden mess that sent cold rivulets down the back of her neck. A centerpiece of tropical flowers went skittering across the deck with a scrape of ceramic, and she lunged for it just as a gust of wind sent it tumbling toward the railing, petals scattering like bright confetti against the darkening sky. "Leave it!" someone shouted over the downpour, but Savannah was already on her hands and knees, the wet wood biting through the fabric of her slacks as she chased floating napkins and tried to gather scattered silverware before they washed over the edge into the sand below. Her blazer clung uncomfortably to her shoulders, and she could feel her mascara starting to streak. But the thought of explaining dozens of missing place settings to corporate made her stomach clench. That's when Lex appeared beside her, wielding a resort umbrella like a shield against the torrent, and laughing, actually laughing, as she helped corral a runaway tablecloth that billowed and snapped in the wind. Her white linen shirt was already transparent and clinging to her skin, outlining the curves Savannah had spent 3 years trying to forget, and she tried desperately not to notice the way the rain had made Lex's hair curl at the edges in those familiar dark spirals, or how her eyes sparkled with something that looked dangerously close to pure delight. "This is insane," Lex shouted, grabbing a handful of scattered coasters while water streamed down her face in silver trails. The umbrella was doing absolutely nothing against the sideways rain, but she held it anyway with stubborn determination. "You're going to catch pneumonia." "Resort property," Savannah yelled back, stuffing soggy napkins into her blazer pockets with the grim determination of someone who'd spent too many years explaining damage inventory to corporate auditors. Her voice came out breathless and slightly hysterical. "Insurance claims are a nightmare." They worked together in the beautiful chaos, bumping shoulders as they collected debris, Savannah's methodical efficiency clashing with Lex's haphazard enthusiasm. When the wind nearly ripped the umbrella from Lex's grip, sending it cartwheeling toward the ocean, they both dissolved into breathless giggles that felt absurd and exhilarating and completely removed from the careful, professional distance they'd been maintaining all week. The rain was warm and insistent, tropical and alive, and every time Savannah tried to wipe her face with the back of her hand, more water immediately took its place, streaming down her cheeks and tasting faintly of salt from the ocean spray. Lightning split the sky overhead in a brilliant electric fork, followed by a crack of thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the deck. They both jumped, Savannah's heart hammering against her ribs, and Lex dropped the umbrella entirely, letting it clatter across the boards as she grabbed Savannah's hand, warm and sure and completely without hesitation. "Okay, that's enough," she said, her fingers intertwining with Savannah's as she pulled her toward the main building, their joined hands slipping slightly from the rain. Another flash illuminated the deck in stark white relief, turning everything momentarily surreal and dreamlike. "The napkins are not worth getting electrocuted." They ran through puddles that had formed in moments, their feet splashing through water that was already ankle-deep in some spots. Savannah's blazer was beyond salvaging, and her carefully pressed slacks were plastered to her legs, but something about the shared absurdity of being thoroughly drenched had dissolved the tension that had been sitting between them for days. Lex was still holding her hand, and Savannah didn't pull away. The covered walkway provided minimal relief. The rain was coming down sideways now, driven by wind that howled through the palm trees and sent spray across the normally protected paths. They pressed against the building, catching their breath while water dripped from their clothes and formed puddles at their feet. "You're sweet," Lex asked, having to raise her voice to be heard over the storm. "It's closer than the main lobby." Savannah nodded, too breathless and waterlogged to argue. They made another mad dash across the courtyard, and by the time they reached her door, they were both gasping with laughter and shivering despite the tropical warmth of the rain. Her hand shook slightly as she fumbled with the keycard, whether from cold or adrenaline or the proximity of Lex hovering just behind her shoulder. The card reader beeped red twice before finally accepting her sodden credentials, and when the door swung open, she gestured Lex inside with a wave that tried to look casual. "Can't have guests getting struck by lightning on my watch," she muttered, but her voice came out rougher than intended. "Corporate really would have my head then." They stood awkwardly just inside the threshold for a moment, water pooling at their feet on the pristine tile floor and dripping from their clothes with soft, rhythmic sounds that seemed unnaturally loud in the silence. Savannah's suite was exactly as she'd left it that morning. Bed made with military precision, the corners tucked so tight you could bounce a quarter off them, work papers organized in neat stacks on the mahogany desk. Not a single personal item visible, except for the phone charger plugged into the wall like a confession of basic human need. The space felt suddenly smaller with Lex in it, her presence disrupting the careful order Savannah had cultivated. The scent of rain and something distinctly Lex, that blend of coconut sunscreen and adventure that had always clung to her skin, filled the sterile air. "I'll get us some towels," Savannah said, her voice coming out steadier than she felt as she disappeared into the bathroom, before the silence could stretch into something more loaded than it already was. Her reflection in the mirror showed a woman with mascara smudged beneath her eyes and hair plastered to her skull, looking nothing like the composed resort manager she prided herself on being. She grabbed 2 fluffy resort towels from the warming rack, their softness a stark contrast to her clammy skin, and took a steadying breath that did absolutely nothing to calm her racing pulse. When she returned, she handed one to Lex with careful fingers that managed to avoid contact entirely, though the brief space between their hands seemed to crackle with unspoken tension. Lex accepted it with a murmured thanks, her voice rougher than usual, and immediately began toweling her hair with movements that were graceful despite their urgency. The terry cloth created dark ringlets that framed her face in loose spirals, water still beading on her collarbones where her tank top clung to her skin in a way that made Savannah's chest tighten unexpectedly. The lights flickered once, twice, then went out completely with a soft electrical sound. Emergency candles activated automatically around the room with quiet whooshes, casting everything in a warm, golden glow that was infinitely more intimate than the harsh overhead lighting had been. Shadows danced across the walls, softening the sharp edges of Savannah's carefully controlled space and making it feel like somewhere else entirely. Somewhere dangerous. Her breath caught in her throat as the sudden shift in atmosphere seemed to shrink the space between them to almost nothing, the air thick with humidity and possibility. Lex was still working the towel through her hair, her movements slower now, more deliberate, when she noticed Savannah shivering. The damp clothes clinging to her frame and the relentless air conditioning created a chill that had nothing to do with the tropical warmth still radiating from outside, where rain continued to patter against the windows in a rhythm that felt almost hypnotic. Without thinking, or maybe thinking too much, Lex stepped closer, the floorboards creaking softly under her bare feet. She wrapped the towel around Savannah's shoulders with sure, gentle movements, her hands lingering for just a moment longer than necessary as she smoothed the fabric across Savannah's shoulder blades. Her fingers were warm despite the rain, and they left ghost impressions on Savannah's skin even through the terry cloth. The gesture was protective, tender, and dangerously familiar. It was exactly the kind of thing Lex would have done 3 years ago when taking care of Savannah had been as natural as breathing, before everything fell apart. Their eyes met in the candlelight, faces inches apart, and Savannah felt the world narrow to this single moment. She could see water droplets still clinging to Lex's dark eyelashes like tiny crystals, could smell her familiar vanilla perfume, that same intoxicating scent that used to linger on Savannah's pillowcases, now mixed with rain and something distinctly tropical, that spoke of hibiscus and salt air. Time seemed suspended, as neither of them moved away, the weight of everything unspoken hanging in the air between them like the charge before lightning strikes, heavy and electric and inevitable. The kiss happened slowly, inevitably, starting soft and questioning as if Lex was asking permission Savannah couldn't bring herself to deny. Her lips were warm despite the rain, gentle in a way that made Savannah's chest ache with recognition. When Savannah didn't pull away, when she couldn't pull away, it became urgent and desperate, 3 years of buried longing pouring out in the press of lips and the desperate slide of tongues. Savannah's hands fisted in Lex's damp shirt, the cotton soft and clinging from the storm, pulling her closer as if proximity could somehow bridge the gap that had opened between them that summer in Barcelona, as if she could physically close the distance that had stretched across continents and time. Lex tasted like rain and possibility, like everything Savannah had tried to forget, and she felt herself drowning in the familiar weight of wanting something she'd convinced herself she could live without. Her heart was hammering against her ribs so hard she was certain Lex could feel it, and she could feel Lex's pulse racing under her fingertips where they pressed against the warm column of her throat, proof that this moment was affecting them both with the same devastating intensity. When Lex's fingers found the hem of her blouse, trailing fire along the strip of skin at her waist, Savannah helped her pull it over her head without breaking the kiss, desperate to feel skin against skin after so many years of careful distance and practiced indifference. The air was warm against her bare shoulders, but she shivered anyway, hyper-aware of every sensation, the softness of Lex's hands, the way her breath hitched, the gentle scrape of her teeth against Savannah's lower lip. But when Lex's hands moved to her broad clasp, fingers sure and familiar, reality crashed over her like cold water, dousing the heat with sudden, paralyzing clarity. "Wait," she whispered against Lex's mouth, the word barely audible but landing between them like a small explosion. Panic suddenly overwhelmed desire as every logical reason, This was a terrible idea flooded her brain at once. The retreat, their professional obligations, the fact that Lex would leave again, the way her heart might not survive being broken twice. Lex immediately stilled her hands and pulled back to search Savannah's face in the flickering candlelight, her brown eyes soft with concern rather than frustration, patient in a way that somehow made everything worse and better at the same time. "Too much?" she asked gently, her voice barely above a whisper. "We can stop." The kindness in her eyes nearly broke Savannah's resolve entirely. It would have been easier if Lex had been pushy or impatient, if she'd given Savannah something to push against. Instead, she was being exactly the person Savannah had fallen in love with 3 years ago, thoughtful and careful and willing to put Savannah's comfort before her own desire. Instead of pulling away completely, Savannah took Lex's hand and led her to the bed, something in her chest loosening when Lex followed without question or hesitation. They lay down together on top of the covers, still in their damp clothes that clung uncomfortably to their skin, Lex's arm settling around Savannah's waist like it belonged there, like it had never left, while Savannah's head found its way to the familiar curve of Lex's shoulder. They didn't speak, just listened to the rain hammering relentlessly against the windows and each other's gradually slowing heartbeats. The storm outside seemed to mirror the one brewing between them, all thunder and electricity with nowhere to go. Savannah could feel Lex's thumb tracing small, unconscious circles against her hip through the damp fabric, a gesture so achingly familiar it made her throat tight with unnamed emotion. The same gentle rhythm Lex had used 3 years ago during quiet mornings and lazy afternoons when the world had felt limitless and full of possibility. She was trembling, not from the cold dampness of her clothes anymore, but from the overwhelming weight of everything they weren't saying, everything that still sat unresolved between them like a landmine waiting to explode at the slightest provocation. Her fingers curled against Lex's collarbone, feeling the steady pulse beneath warm skin, and she had to fight the urge to either pull closer or bolt entirely. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the island, but inside the candlelit cocoon of her suite, pressed against the warmth of Lex's body, Savannah felt safer than she had in years, and that, more than anything else, terrified her completely.
Lex, Chapter 8. Someone Always Leaves. The first thing Lex noticed was warmth. Not the sticky, oppressive heat of the Caribbean morning, but the gentle, bone-deep warmth of another person's body pressed against hers. Her arm had found its way around Savannah's waist sometime during the night, fingers splayed protectively across the soft cotton of her tank top, and Savannah had curled into her like she belonged there, like the 3 years between Barcelona and this moment had collapsed into nothing. Lex held perfectly still in the pre-dawn darkness, afraid that even the slightest movement might break whatever spell had allowed this to happen. Savannah's breathing was deep and even, her face relaxed in sleep, free from the careful control she wore like armor during waking hours. Her dark hair had escaped its neat ponytail and spread across the pillow in waves that caught the faint light filtering through the curtains, and Lex wanted to reach out and touch it, to run her fingers through the silky strands like she used to during those lazy Barcelona mornings when the world had felt infinite and full of possibility. Instead, she focused on memorizing everything. The way Savannah's body fit perfectly against the curve of her own, the soft sound of her breathing, the weight of her head on Lex's shoulder, the familiar scent of her shampoo, something citrusy and clean that hadn't changed in 3 years, the way her hand had come to rest against Lex's collarbone, fingers curled loosely, trusting even in sleep. This was what she'd dreamed about during long nights in hostels across 3 continents. Not the passion or the heat, though those had been devastating too, but this quiet intimacy. The simple miracle of waking up beside someone who knew all her stories, who'd seen her without filters or performance, who'd loved her anyway. The person she'd been stupid enough to walk away from because she'd been too scared to believe she deserved something this good. The years of sleeping alone in narrow hostel bunks and cramped rental cars suddenly felt like a wasteland compared to this, Savannah's steady breathing creating a rhythm that made Lex's chest ache with longing. She'd forgotten how it felt to belong somewhere, to someone, to have her restless energy find its perfect counterbalance in another person's stillness. The way Savannah's presence made her feel anchored instead of adrift, like all her wandering had finally led her back to where she was meant to be. The light was growing stronger now, painting the room in soft gold that caught the auburn highlights in Savannah's hair and cast gentle shadows across the rumpled sheets. Lex knew she had to leave, not because she wanted to. Every fiber of her being wanted to stay right here, to be holding Savannah when she woke up, to see if last night's tenderness might survive the harsh light of morning. But she could read the signs in Savannah's sleeping face, the tiny line of tension between her brows that suggested even her dreams weren't entirely peaceful, the slight downward turn at the corners of her mouth that spoke of worries that followed her even into sleep. When Savannah woke up and had time to think about what had happened, to remember all the reasons this was complicated and dangerous, she was going to regret it. The careful walls she'd rebuilt would slam back into place, and Lex couldn't bear to see that regret in her eyes. The same look of hurt and confusion that had haunted Lex's memory for 3 years. Moving with the careful precision of someone who'd learned to pack up and disappear without waking hostile roommates, Lex slowly extracted her arm from around Savannah's waist. Her skin felt cold where it had been pressed against Savannah's warmth, and she had to resist the urge to curl back into that perfect fit of bodies. She paused when Savannah stirred slightly, her breathing changing rhythm and a soft sound escaping her lips, almost like a protest at the loss of contact. But she only shifted deeper into the pillow without waking, her dark hair spilling across the white cotton like something out of a dream Lex never wanted to end. Lex eased herself off the bed, inch by inch, testing each movement to make sure the mattress didn't creak or bounce, her bare feet finding silent purchase on the cool tile floor. At the door, she turned back for one last look. Savannah looked younger in sleep. The sharp edges of her professional composure softened into something vulnerable and achingly beautiful. Her lips were slightly parted, catching the pale morning light that filtered through the gauzy curtains, and there was a small crease on her cheek from the pillowcase that Lex wanted to smooth away with her thumb. The urge was so strong she had to curl her fingers into her palm to resist reaching out. Instead, she pressed her own fingers to her lips and then to the door frame, a silent kiss goodbye, a promise that she wouldn't push for more than Savannah was ready to give. The wood was cool and solid beneath her fingertips, grounding her in a moment that felt too fragile to be real. The hallway was empty and quiet, the resort still sleeping, except for the distant sounds of early staff preparing for the day, the soft clink of dishes from the kitchen, the gentle hum of maintenance equipment somewhere far below. Lex's bare feet made no sound on the cool tile as she padded back to her own room, her damp clothes from the night before clinging uncomfortably to her skin like a reminder of everything that had shifted between them in those stolen hours. The salt from the ocean spray had dried stiff in the fabric, and she could still taste the sea air on her lips. She felt like a teenager sneaking back after breaking curfew, heart pounding with a mixture of guilt and exhilaration that made her chest tight and her breathing shallow. Her own room felt stark and impersonal after the warm intimacy of Savannah's suite. The standardized tropical decor suddenly garish, the air conditioning too cold against her sun-warmed skin. The unmade bed where she hadn't slept looked accusatory in the growing daylight. The scattered clothes and equipment that marked her as just another temporary guest passing through, now feeling like evidence of a life lived in constant motion. She sat on the edge of the mattress, still wearing yesterday's wrinkled shorts and tank top that smelled faintly of Savannah's shampoo, and pulled out her phone with hands that weren't entirely steady. The screen's blue glow felt harsh after the golden softness of dawn breaking through linen curtains. The blank message screen mocked her with its cursor blinking steadily, each flash like a tiny accusation of cowardice. What could she possibly say? Thanks for last night sounded crude, reducing the tenderness they'd shared to something transactional. I'm thinking about you sounded desperate, like she was already clinging when Savannah had barely let her walls down. I'm sorry for leaving opened up conversations she wasn't sure Savannah wanted to have. Not yet, maybe not ever. She typed and deleted a dozen different messages, her thumb hovering over the keyboard as words appeared and vanished like thoughts she couldn't quite catch. Each attempt felt wrong in a different way, too casual, dismissing the weight of what had passed between them, too intense, demanding more than Savannah might be ready to give, too presumptuous, assuming last night had meant the same thing to both of them. Too distant, as if those hours of quiet intimacy hadn't rewired something fundamental in Lex's chest. The morning light streaming through her window had shifted from golden to harsh white by the time she finally set the phone aside without sending anything, the device warm from being clutched too tightly in her palms. Maybe some moments were meant to exist without commentary, without the need to dissect and define and turn into digital communication that could be screenshot and analyzed and misunderstood. Maybe the memory of Savannah's body curved against hers, trusting and warm, her breathing finally, even after years of holding herself so carefully apart, was enough for now. By the time she made it down to the Heart Deck for breakfast 2 hours later, showered and changed into fresh clothes that didn't smell like yesterday's uncertainty, Lex had convinced herself that she could navigate this with grace. The scent of coffee and tropical fruit drifted on the morning breeze, mixing with the salt air and the sound of guests already gathering around bistro tables draped with cheerful linens. She'd approach Savannah like nothing had changed, give her space to process without the weight of Lex's expectations pressing against her shoulders, let her set the tone for whatever came next. No pressure, no expectations, just two professionals co-hosting a retreat who happened to have shared a bed for a few hours without crossing any lines that couldn't be uncrossed, even if every nerve ending in Lex's body suggested otherwise. She spotted Savannah immediately at a corner table, already dressed in her crisp resort attire with her hair pulled back into its usual neat ponytail. Her clipboard was out, pen in hand, every inch the competent operations manager who had everything under control. It was like looking at a completely different person from the woman who'd melted into her arms the night before, and Lex felt something cold settle in her stomach. Still, she grabbed 2 cups of coffee from the breakfast buffet, rich, dark roasts that reminded her of the cafe in Barcelona where they used to sit for hours, and approached with what she hoped was a tentative but reassuring smile. The ceramic felt warm against her palms, grounding her as her heart hammered against her ribs. "Morning?" she said softly, setting one of the cups near Savannah's elbow with the careful precision of someone placing an offering at an altar. "Thought you might need caffeine after." "Good morning, Alexandra." Savannah's voice was crisp and professional, each syllable perfectly enunciated like she was addressing a guest she'd never met before. She barely glanced up from her clipboard, her pen continuing its precise movements across whatever task demanded her attention. The formal use of her full name hit Lex like a physical blow to the solar plexus, creating instant distance between them that felt wider than the ocean beyond the windows. Nobody called her Alexandra except her mother when she was in trouble, and hearing it from Savannah's lips that had whispered her nickname like a prayer just hours ago, felt like being slapped with a silk glove. Lex's smile faltered and died, her hand still wrapped around her own coffee cup for something to hold on to while the world tilted sideways. The warmth from the ceramic seeped through her fingers, but it couldn't touch the cold that had settled in her chest. She started, then stopped. The words tangling on her tongue like fishing line. How could she bridge the gap that had suddenly opened between them, wide as a canyon and twice as treacherous? Last night felt like it had happened to different people, in a different universe where they were allowed to touch each other without consequences, where Savannah's defenses had crumbled like sugar in the rain. "Lex!" Indy Monroe's voice cut through the tension like a bright, cheerful blade as she bounced over to their table with her phone already out and recording. "Perfect timing! I was just about to do a morning check-in with my followers. You look amazing. That golden hour lighting is everything." Lex forced herself to turn toward Indy, grateful for the distraction, even as she felt Savannah's continued cold distance like a weight on her shoulders. "Hey, Indy, getting some good content this week?" "The absolute best. This place is paradise, and having you here is like influencer goals achieved." Indy was practically vibrating with enthusiasm as she switched her phone to selfie mode and leaned in close to Lex. "Say hi to my followers. They're obsessed with your travel content." Lex managed a smile that felt more natural than it should have, slipping easily into the performance that had become second nature over the past few years. "Hey, everyone! Having an amazing time here at Coral Bay. The sunrises alone are worth the trip." "Speaking of trips," Indy said, her eyes bright with curiosity, "I've been dying to ask about your upcoming travel plans. Where's the Wanderlust taking you next? My followers are always looking for destination inspiration." The question caught Lex off guard, her media-trained brain scrambling for an answer that would satisfy Indy's audience while not revealing how uncertain her actual plans were. "Actually, I'm thinking about doing an extended European tour," she heard herself saying, the words coming out louder than she intended, carrying across the quiet breakfast deck. Maybe 3 months, hitting all the hidden gems, the places that don't make it into the guidebook. It was complete bullshit. She had no firm travel plans beyond this week, and the European tour was something Renee had mentioned months ago that Lex had never committed to. But it sounded good, adventurous and aspirational, exactly what Indy's followers would want to hear from a travel influencer who'd built her brand on constant movement and fearless exploration. Out of the corner of her eye, Lex saw Savannah's pen stop moving across her clipboard. The silence that followed was almost imperceptible, but Lex caught the way Savannah's jaw tightened, the tiny shift in her posture that spoke of disappointment carefully controlled. Too late, Lex realized how her words must sound to someone who already believed she was incapable of staying in one place, who'd watched her leave once before without explanation. "Oh my God, Europe," Indy gushed, apparently oblivious to the tension radiating from the other side of the table. The photography opportunities alone. Paris, Barcelona, those tiny villages in Tuscany, your Instagram is going to be insane. Have you thought about doing a collaboration series, like finding local influencers in each city? Each mention of travel plans felt like another nail in a coffin Lex hadn't realized she was building. She watched Savannah's shoulders grow more rigid, saw the way her grip tightened on her pen, and wanted desperately to take back every word. To explain that the Europe trip was just nervous rambling. Words chosen to fill an uncomfortable moment rather than actual plans. That the only place she wanted to travel to right now was back upstairs to Savannah's room, back to the quiet intimacy they'd shared before the morning had complicated everything. Instead, she found herself nodding along to Indy's enthusiasm, playing the part of the adventurous travel blogger while internally screaming at her own stupidity. Still in the planning stages, she managed, hoping to sound non-committal enough that she could walk it back later. You know how it is. So many amazing places, not enough time. The eternal traveler's dilemma, Indy agreed with a laugh. Well, wherever you end up, I'll be following along. Your content always makes me want to pack a bag and disappear somewhere amazing. Savannah stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the deck with more force than necessary. "Excuse me," she said to no one in particular, her voice professionally polite but strained around the edges. "I need to check the pool temperatures for today's activities." It was obviously an excuse. Lex had seen the maintenance staff testing the water an hour earlier, but Savannah was already walking away, her spine straight and her stride purposeful. She didn't look back, didn't give Lex a chance to explain or apologize or somehow undo the damage of the last 10 minutes. Lex watched her go, feeling the familiar ache of watching Savannah walk away settle deep in her chest. It was the same feeling she'd carried for 3 years. The hollow sensation of knowing she'd hurt the one person she most wanted to protect. Except this time, she couldn't even pretend she hadn't seen it coming. "Is everything okay?" Indy asked, finally picking up on the tension that had been crackling between them. "Did I say something wrong?" "No, you're fine," Lex said, forcing another smile that felt like wearing a mask. Savannah just takes her job seriously. Lots of details to manage. But even as she said it, she knew that wasn't what this was about. This was about Lex confirming every fear Savannah had about her inability to stay in one place, about her being just another traveler passing through rather than someone who might actually put down roots. The progress they'd made the night before, the tentative trust, the careful vulnerability, had crumbled like sand through her fingers, destroyed by her own thoughtless words. Indy continued chattering about travel plans and content opportunities, but Lex barely heard her. All her attention was focused on the empty space where Savannah had been sitting, the cooling coffee cup she'd left behind, the clipboard with her neat handwriting that documented every detail of the retreat except the one thing that mattered most. Whether they had any chance of finding their way back to each other, or if Lex had just confirmed that some mistakes were too big to overcome.
Savannah. Chapter 9. Treading Water. The snorkeling boat rocked gently as guests filed aboard, their excited chatter mixing with the sound of waves lapping against the hull. Savannah positioned herself strategically next to Carmen on the portside bench, clipboard balanced on her knees as she made a show of reviewing safety protocols she could recite in her sleep. Through her dark sunglasses, she watched Lex work the crowd at the bow, animated hands gesturing as she explained the underwater camera equipment to a cluster of eager guests. "You know those procedures by heart," Carmen observed dryly, watching Savannah flip through the same laminated pages for the third time. Pretty sure you wrote half of them. Just being thorough, Savannah replied, keeping her voice level as she clicked her pen with mechanical precision. The sound was sharp enough to cut through the ambient noise of the boat engine and guest conversation, a tiny percussion of control in a morning that already felt too chaotic. From the bow came Lex's distinctive laugh, warm and infectious as she responded to something Indy had said about underwater photography angles. The sound tugged at something in Savannah's chest that she'd been trying to ignore since breakfast, a familiar ache wrapped in 3 years of carefully constructed distance. She flipped another page with unnecessary force. Carmen leaned closer, lowering her voice to barely above a whisper. You planning to glare at those safety instructions until they spontaneously combust, or are you going to tell me what's really going on? Nothing's going on, Savannah said, though the defensive edge in her tone suggested otherwise. I'm doing my job, managing the retreat, making sure our guests have a safe, enjoyable experience. Carmen's skepticism was practically audible. That why you've been white-knuckling that pen since we left the dock? Before Savannah could formulate a response that didn't involve admitting her emotional state, Captain Miguel's voice crackled over the intercom. Approaching the reef site, folks. Water's crystal clear today. Visibility's about 80 feet. Perfect conditions for our underwater photographers. The boat's engine shifted to idle as they reached the snorkeling location, and Savannah felt her stomach clench with a mixture of anticipation and dread. In the water, maintaining professional distance would be even harder. No clipboards to hide behind, no safety protocols to obsess over, just the reef and the guests, and Lex in her element. Remember, buddy system, Savannah called out as guests began checking their gear. Stay within sight of a staff member at all times. The current's gentle today, but let's not take any chances. She adjusted her own mask and fins with practiced efficiency, grateful for the familiar routine. Underwater, she could focus on the reef formations, the marine life, the technical aspects of guest safety. Underwater, there was no room for the kind of emotional turbulence that had been churning through her since she'd overheard Lex's casual mention of European travel plans. Because, of course, she's already planning her next escape, Savannah thought bitterly as she slipped into the crystal-clear water. Did I really think one night of almost intimacy would change anything? The warm Caribbean water enveloped her like a familiar embrace, and for a moment the tension in her shoulders began to ease. This was her domain, the underwater world where she'd spent countless hours as a dive instructor before moving into resort management. Down here, she knew exactly who she was and what she was supposed to do. Savannah swam deliberately toward the coral formations on the far side of the reef, as far from Lex photography group as the safety parameters would allow. Carmen followed without comment, understanding the unspoken request for buffer space. They moved through the water with quiet synchronization, two professionals doing what they did best, while carefully avoiding the emotional minefield floating somewhere between them and the bow group. The reef was spectacular today. Brain coral formations painted in brilliant oranges and purples, schools of yellowtail snappers darting between the structures like living confetti. Under normal circumstances, Savannah would have lost herself in the underwater landscape, found peace in the gentle rhythm of her breathing and the weightless sensation of moving through liquid space. Instead, she found her attention drifting repeatedly to the cluster of guests visible in her peripheral vision, to Lex's unmistakable silhouette as she guided the photographers toward the best vantage points. Focus, she told herself, turning her attention to a particularly vibrant section of staghorn coral. You're here to supervise, not to... A sharp splash and panicked gasping shattered the underwater tranquility. Savannah's head broke the surface just in time to see Maya from Portland flailing in the water about 30 yards away, her mask askew and her breathing rapid and shallow. There was something. Maya's words came in gasps as she struggled to keep her head above water, clearly in the grip of panic that had nothing to do with actual danger and everything to do with fear. Savannah started swimming toward the distressed guest, her rescue training kicking in automatically, but Lex was already there. She moved through the water with swift, practiced strokes, covering the distance between her photography group and Maya in seconds. Her approach was calm and controlled, the kind of maritime competence that came from years of ocean experience rather than resort certification courses. "You're okay. I've got you," Lex said as she reached Maya, her voice carrying clearly across the water despite the gentle waves. She positioned herself carefully, supporting Maya's shoulders without crowding her, creating a sense of stability without constraint. "Just breathe with me, in through your nose, out through your mouth." Savannah treaded water and watched, telling herself she was maintaining supervisory oversight while privately admitting she was transfixed. This was Lex at her most essential, not the charismatic influencer or the flirty travel blogger, but the woman who instinctively moved toward people in need, who offered comfort without making it about herself. "That's it. You're doing great," Lex continued, her voice steady and reassuring. She'd positioned herself so Maya could make eye contact easily, creating an anchor point of calm in what had felt like chaos moments before. "What you felt was probably just a fish. They're curious little guys down here. Want to tell me what you saw?" "It was yellow and blue," Maya managed, her breathing starting to slow as Lex's presence worked its magic. "It just brushed against my leg and I panicked." "Ah, sounds like you met one of our sergeant majors," Lex said with a gentle smile, beginning to guide Maya slowly back toward the boat. "They're basically the golden retrievers of the reef. Friendly, nosy, completely harmless. They love investigating new visitors." As they moved through the water together, Lex kept up a steady stream of soothing commentary, sharing details about the marine life that transformed Maya's fear into curiosity. She pointed out a school of blue tangs gliding past, the way sunlight filtered through the water to create dancing patterns on the sea floor, the gentle grace of a hawksbill turtle feeding in the distance. Savannah found herself following at a discreet distance, ostensibly to assist, but really to witness this side of Lex that had nothing to do with cameras or social media presence. This was the woman who'd spent hours explaining cloud formations during their long-ago summer, who'd coaxed Savannah into trying foods she'd never heard of, with the same patient encouragement she was showing Maya now. "This is why I fell for her," Savannah realized with a pang that felt like physical pain. Not the adventure or the spontaneity, but this, the way she shows up for people without thinking about what she gets in return. Back on the boat, Lex wrapped Maya in a soft towel and settled beside her on one of the bench seats, completely focused on making sure her unexpected crisis had transformed into something manageable. She shared stories about her own early snorkeling mishaps, the time she'd been startled by a parrotfish in Thailand, the minor panic attack she'd had during her first night dive in the Maldives, normalizing Maya's experience while making her laugh. "The thing about the ocean," Lex said, tucking the towel more securely around Maya's shoulders, "is that it's full of surprises. But most of them are good ones, even when they catch us off guard." Savannah busied herself with post-dive protocols, checking gear and updating the activity log, but her attention remained divided. Every few minutes she found her gaze drifting to the easy way Lex sat with Maya, the gentle humor she used to transform embarrassment into shared experience, the complete absence of judgment or impatience. It was the same instinctive kindness that had drawn Savannah in years ago, and watching it now felt like reopening a wound she'd convinced herself had healed. By the time they returned to the marina, Maya was laughing about her underwater encounter and already making plans for the afternoon reef walk. Lex had stayed with her throughout the boat ride, sharing photography tips and pointing out landmarks along the coast, ensuring that what could have been a traumatic experience became just another adventure story. "Thank you," Maya said as they disembarked, squeezing Lex's hand with genuine gratitude. "I was so embarrassed, but you made it feel okay. Normal, even." "It was completely normal," Lex assured her. "The ocean takes some getting used to. Give it another chance tomorrow. I bet you'll love it." Savannah watched the exchange from behind her sunglasses, feeling the familiar tightness in her chest that came from seeing Lex be everything she remembered and more. The competence, the intuitive emotional intelligence, the way she made people feel seen and valued. It was all still there, wrapped up in a woman who was apparently planning to disappear to Europe the moment this week ended. That evening found Savannah at the poolside bar, staring into her second mojito while the sun painted the sky in shades of amber and rose. The usual post-activity crowd had gathered, guests sharing stories from the day's snorkeling adventure, staff members unwinding after their shifts, the gentle hum of vacation conversation mixing with steel drum music from the speakers. And make it a double, Savannah told Marcus when he appeared to refresh her drink. The bartender raised an eyebrow but complied without comment, adding an extra shot of rum to the mint and lime mixture. Carmen materialized beside her, sliding onto the adjacent stool with the kind of understated grace that suggested she'd been keeping an eye on Savannah's alcohol consumption. Rough day on the water? Fine day, Savannah replied, taking a careful sip of her strengthened mojito. Everyone got back safely. Maya's already signed up for tomorrow's reef walk. Mission accomplished. Uh-huh. Carmen ordered her usual virgin piña colada, extra pineapple. That why you're working on drink number 3 at 5:30? Savannah considered correcting her. It was actually drink number 2, just with extra rum, but decided that probably wasn't the defense Carmen was looking for. Instead, she gestured vaguely toward the guest areas where the snorkeling group was still rehashing their underwater encounters. It's decompressing, she said. Long day. Lots of logistics. And it has nothing to do with watching your ex-girlfriend be a literal hero for 20 minutes. Carmen's tone was casual, but her eyes were sharp with the kind of concern that came from years of friendship disguised as professional partnership. Savannah nearly choked on her mojito. She's not? We're not? Right. My mistake. She's just the mysterious woman who makes you drink too much and forget to eat dinner. Carmen caught Marcus's attention and ordered 2 plates of conch fritters without consulting Savannah. Humor me by putting some food in your stomach before you move on to drink number 4. The fritters arrived golden and steaming, accompanied by a spicy aioli that made Savannah's mouth water despite her insistence that she wasn't hungry. She picked at one reluctantly, aware that Carmen was probably right about the food-to-alcohol ratio, but unwilling to admit it out loud. He was good today, Savannah said eventually, surprising herself with the admission. With Maya. Really good. Carmen nodded as if this wasn't news to her. She seems like the kind of person who shows up when people need her. The observation hit closer to home than Savannah was prepared for. She took another sip of her mojito, using the ritual of drinking to buy herself time to formulate a response that wouldn't reveal too much about the carefully guarded corners of her heart. Shows up and then leaves, she said finally, when the adventure gets boring. Is that what happened before? The question hung in the air between them, deceptively simple but loaded with implications that Savannah wasn't ready to unpack. She focused on the conch fritters, on the way the spicy aioli complemented the sweet, tender seafood, on anything other than the memory of waking up alone in a hotel room 3 years ago, with nothing but a hastily scrawled note and a hollow feeling in her chest. I don't want to talk about it, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Carmen didn't push, which was somehow worse than direct confrontation would have been. She simply sat there, eating her own fritters and radiating the kind of patient availability that made people want to confess things they'd kept buried for years. As the evening progressed, the poolside crowd began to thin. Guests drifted away to pre-mojo dinner showers and wardrobe changes. Staff members clocked out and headed to their own accommodations. The steel drum music shifted to a softer evening playlist. Savannah ordered a 4th mojito, despite Carmen's meaningful glance, telling herself she was off duty and entitled to decompress however she chose. I'm going to grab dinner, Carmen said eventually, standing and stretching with the careful movements of someone who'd spent the day in salt water and sun. You coming? Savannah waved her off with what she hoped looked like casual dismissal. In a bit, just want to finish this and watch the sunset. The concern in Carmen's expression was obvious, but she didn't argue. Don't stay out here too long, she said. Tomorrow's the couples massage workshop and you'll want to be sharp for that particular brand of chaos. Left alone at the bar, Savannah found herself staring out at the moonlit ocean, feeling the rum amplify every conflicted emotion that had been churning through her since breakfast. The logical part of her brain knew she was being self-destructive, knew that drinking away her feelings while sitting alone at a resort bar was probably not the healthiest coping mechanism. The rest of her, the part that had spent 3 years building walls around the memory of Lex Calderon, was grateful for anything that softened the edges of her carefully maintained control. When even Marcus began wiping down glasses with the purposeful efficiency of someone preparing to close the bar, Savannah abandoned her empty mojito glass and walked unsteadily down to the beach. The warm sand shifted under her feet, and she had to concentrate on each step to maintain her balance. but the sound of waves drew her forward like a siren call. She settled heavily onto the sand near the water's edge, pulling her knees to her chest and letting the warm night breeze carry away the tears she'd been holding back since morning. The rum had loosened her carefully maintained control, and sitting here in the darkness with nothing but ocean sounds for company, she finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of everything she'd been trying to ignore. The competence Lex had shown with Maya, the easy kindness, the instinctive way she'd known exactly what the frightened woman needed, the casual mention of European travel plans that confirmed every fear Savannah had about opening herself up to someone who would inevitably leave. Of course she's planning to leave, Savannah thought, letting the tears fall freely now. That's what she does. Show up, be amazing, make you remember why you fell in love with her, and then disappear when something more interesting comes along. The unfairness of it all felt overwhelming in the darkness, amplified by alcohol and exhaustion, and the way the moonlight made everything look like a movie set designed to break her heart. She pressed her face against her knees, breathing in the salt air and trying to find some equilibrium in the gentle rhythm of the waves. Footsteps in the sand behind her made Savannah tense, expecting Carmen with a lecture about professional behavior and the importance of maintaining appearances around resort guests. Instead, when she turned, it was Lex standing hesitantly a few feet away, her expression soft with concern rather than judgment. "Mind if I sit?" Lex asked quietly. Without waiting for an answer that might not come, she lowered herself onto the sand beside Savannah, close enough to offer comfort, but not so close as to feel intrusive. They sat in companionable silence, listening to the gentle crash of waves, while Savannah's defenses slowly crumbled in the face of Lex's patient presence.
Lex, Chapter 10. The Truth Game. The bonfire crackled on the beach as Noelle arranged guests in a circle on colorful floor cushions, her enthusiasm infectious despite the late hour. She moved around the group like a camp counselor on espresso, adjusting seating arrangements and distributing drinks with the kind of manic energy that suggested she'd been planning this particular activity for weeks. "Perfect evening for some soul-bearing, don't you think?" Noelle chirped, gesturing expansively at the star-filled sky above them. "Nothing like firelight and ocean sounds to make people honest." Lex settled onto a purple cushion that had somehow found its way to her feet, the fabric soft and sun-warmed against her bare legs. She was acutely aware of Savannah choosing a spot directly across the fire from her, the deliberate distance feeling like a statement in itself. The flames created a natural barrier between them, crackling and hissing as they devoured driftwood, but they also turned Savannah's face into a study of light and shadow that made Lex's chest tighten with familiar longing. The firelight caught the gold flecks in Savannah's hazel eyes, making them shimmer like sea glass, and Lex had to force herself to look away before she was caught, staring. Even from this distance, across the circle of orange light and shifting smoke, she could see the tension in Savannah's shoulders, the carefully controlled way she held her mojito glass, like it might shatter if she loosened her grip even slightly. The other guests arranged themselves with varying degrees of enthusiasm around the circle. Maya and her partner Claire cuddled up on a shared indigo cushion, still glowing from their successful snorkeling adventure earlier, their sun-kissed skin radiating contentment, as Claire absently traced patterns on Maya's arm. Indy bounced excitedly next to Jordan, a quiet guest who'd arrived solo but seemed to be hitting it off with several members of the group, her nervous energy infectious as she gestured animatedly about something that made Jordan laugh. A few other women Lex had been introduced to but couldn't quite keep straight filled out the circle. There was the lawyer from Seattle with the intricate shoulder tattoo, the artist from Portland who kept sketching in a small notebook, and the teacher from Austin who'd spent most of dinner regaling them with stories about her students. All of them looked relaxed and sun-tired in the best possible way, their faces soft with the kind of vacation bliss that only came after a day of salt water and sunshine. "All right, beautiful souls," Noelle announced, settling onto her own turquoise cushion with a theatrical flourish that sent her gauzy cover-up billowing around her like she was posing for a beach photo shoot. "Time for some truth or talent. The rules are simple but sacred. When it's your turn, you either answer a deeply personal question with complete honesty, or you reveal a hidden talent that will blow our minds. No middle ground allowed, no boring answers accepted." Lex's stomach churned as she realized there was no escaping without looking like a coward in front of the group and, more importantly, in front of Savannah. She'd been to dozens of these kinds of gatherings over the years, part of her travel influencer lifestyle that required constant social interaction and manufactured authenticity for the camera. Usually, she could charm her way through with practiced ease, deflecting serious questions with humor or demonstrating some crowd-pleasing skill she'd picked up during her wandering years, juggling coconuts in Bali, playing ukulele from her stint in Hawaii, or doing card tricks learned from a street performer in Barcelona. But tonight felt different, loaded with the weight of Savannah's watchful gaze and the unspoken history crackling between them like the driftwood in the fire. Tonight felt different. Tonight, with Savannah watching her from across the fire with those unreadable hazel eyes that caught the flickering orange light like amber trapped in glass, every escape route felt like a betrayal. The familiar weight of her camera around her neck suddenly felt heavier, like a shield she couldn't bring herself to lift. "We will start us off to show you how it's done," Noelle continued, consulting a crumpled piece of paper she'd produced from somewhere in the depths of her flowing caftan. The coordinator's enthusiasm radiated across the circle like heat from the fire itself. "Maya, darling, truth or talent?" Maya grinned and snuggled closer to Claire, her movement sending sand cascading off the log they shared. "Talent, definitely. I'm not drunk enough for deep emotional revelations yet. Show us what you've got." The game started light, with Maya demonstrating an impressive ability to touch her nose with her tongue, which earned enthusiastic applause and several attempts at imitation from other guests. The sound of laughter mixed with the rhythmic crash of waves behind them, creating a soundtrack that should have been comforting but only made Lex more aware of how exposed they all were under the vast, star-scattered sky. Claire, followed by revealing she could recite the entire opening monologue from Romeo and Juliet in perfect iambic pentameter, her voice carrying across the beach with surprising beauty that made even the palm fronds seem to still and listen. Indy confessed her secret crush on her college roommate when her turn came around, blushing prettily in the firelight as laughter rippled around the circle like gentle waves. "She was straight and dating this awful finance bro," Indy explained, gesturing dramatically with her drink, the liquid catching the light as it sloshed. "But God, she had this way of braiding her hair while she studied that just made me want to write poetry about her fingers." The mood remained playful through a few more rounds, with talents ranging from impressive beatboxing that had everyone bobbing their heads to an uncanny ability to guess people's astrological signs with startling accuracy. Lex found herself relaxing slightly, her shoulders dropping as she sank deeper into the worn beach cushion beneath her, thinking maybe she could coast through this without having to bare her soul in front of a group of strangers and the one person whose opinion mattered most. The salt air filled her lungs with each breath, and for a moment she almost forgot about the weight of Savannah's gaze, burning steady and patient across the dying embers. Then Jordan's turn came, and everything shifted. "Ruth?" Jordan said quietly when Noelle posed the question, and something in her tone made the group lean forward slightly. Noelle consulted her list again. "What's the worst thing you've done in the name of love?" Jordan was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire with an expression that suggested she was seeing something far more painful than dancing flames. Finally, she spoke. "Stole my sister's girlfriend in high school?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried clearly in the still night air. "Rachel was everything I thought I wanted. Beautiful, confident, popular. When she started dating my sister Amy, I told myself I was just being friendly, but really I was slowly, deliberately undermining their relationship." The circle had gone completely silent, except for the pop and crackle of burning driftwood. Jordan continued, her words gaining strength as she pushed through what was clearly a painful confession. "I'd text Rachel when Amy wasn't around, invite her to hang out, listen to her complain about my sister, and then subtly agree with all her criticisms. It took 6 months, but eventually she broke up with Amy and started dating me instead." Jordan looked up from the fire, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Amy didn't speak to me for 2 years. Rachel and I lasted 3 weeks before she realized what kind of person I really was." The mood had shifted into deeper territory, and Lex caught Savannah's eye across the flames, both of them recognizing the dangerous direction this was heading. There was something in Savannah's expression, a wariness mixed with curiosity that made Lex's pulse quicken. The firelight caught the gold flecks in Savannah's hazel eyes, and for a moment, it was like looking at the woman she'd fallen for all those years ago. the one who used to watch sunsets with that same careful intensity. Whatever defenses had been rebuilt over the past day were clearly cracking under the influence of rum and firelight and the strange intimacy of shared confessions. Two more guests took their turns, each truth more personal than the last, each talent feeling less like performance and more like offering pieces of themselves to the group. Lex barely registered their words, too focused on the way Savannah's shoulders had relaxed, the way she'd stopped checking her watch every few minutes. The fire had burned lower, casting longer shadows that danced across weathered wood and sun-kissed skin, creating an even more intimate atmosphere that seemed to encourage honesty. The ocean's rhythm provided a steady backdrop, waves washing against the shore in a hypnotic pattern that made everything feel suspended in time. Salt air mixed with wood smoke, and Lex found herself leaning forward slightly, drawn by an invisible current that had nothing to do with the ocean breeze. Finally, inevitably, Noelle turned to Lex with a mischievous grin. "Her wandering storyteller," she announced. "Truth or talent?" Lex's mouth went dry as she considered her options. She could demonstrate her ability to whistle any song perfectly, or show off the juggling skills she'd picked up from street performers in Prague. She could make them laugh with her impression of a British travel show host, or wow them with her knowledge of obscure cocktail recipes from around the world. All of it would feel like running away from the real conversation, hanging between her and Savannah like smoke from the fire. "Truth," Lex said quietly, her voice barely carrying over the crackling fire. She saw Savannah's posture straighten with tension across the circle, saw the way her fingers tightened around her drink. The group leaned forward expectantly as Noelle consulted her list of questions, taking her time with theatrical deliberation. "Perfect," Noelle said finally, her voice carrying a hint of satisfaction that suggested she'd been hoping Lex would choose this path. "Here's your question. What's something you regret not saying to someone important in your life?" The question hit Lex like a physical blow, driving all the air from her lungs in a single, sharp exhale. The words she'd been carrying for 3 years suddenly pressed against her throat, demanding release after so much careful containment. Her hands trembled slightly as she set down her drink, buying herself a moment to gather the courage she'd been building toward all week. The silence stretched as Lex stared into the fire, feeling the weight of 12 pairs of eyes on her, but most importantly, feeling Savannah's gaze burning across the space between them. This was her moment to be brave or be a coward forever. The flames danced hypnotically, and for a moment Lex was transported back to another fire, 3 years ago on a different beach in a different country. Savannah had been curled against her side that night, both of them wrapped in a stolen hotel blanket, talking about everything and nothing while the Mediterranean lapped at the shore. Lex had wanted to say the words then, had felt them burning behind her teeth, like the smoke from their driftwood fire. "I love you." Such simple words, but they'd felt enormous then, too big for someone who'd built her life around movement and freedom. She'd swallowed them instead, kissed Savannah's temple, and told herself there would be time later. There was always supposed to be more time. "I loved someone," Lex began, her voice growing stronger with each word as she forced herself to look up from the fire. "And I never told her before I left." The group went completely still, the only sounds the pop and hiss of burning driftwood and the gentle rush of waves against the shore. Lex forced herself to meet Savannah's wide, stunned eyes across the fire, seeing shock, and something that might be hope flickering there in the dancing light. "I was scared," she continued, the words tumbling out now that the dam had finally burst, "of the intensity of not being enough, of breaking something beautiful by wanting it too much. She is, the kind of person who deserves stability, consistency, someone who can promise forever instead of just right now. I thought leaving without saying it was kinder than saying it and then leaving anyway." Somewhere in the circle, someone drew in a sharp breath. Lex barely noticed. Her entire world narrowed to Savannah's face and the way the firelight caught the tears forming in her eyes. "Did you ever try to reach out after?" Maya asked softly, her voice gentle with understanding. Lex shook her head, still holding Savannah's gaze across the fire. "Some mistakes feel too big to fix, but that doesn't mean you stop loving someone. It just means you learn to live with the weight of it." The confession hung in the air between them like a bridge Lex had built but didn't know if Savannah would cross. Every breath felt deliberate, every heartbeat too loud in the sudden quiet that had fallen over the group. Noelle cleared her throat gently, clearly recognizing the charged atmosphere and trying to navigate it with uncharacteristic delicacy. "Well," she said, her usual theatrical flair subdued into something more appropriate for the moment. That was beautifully honest. Thank you for sharing that with us, Lex. She consulted her list again, clearly preparing to move to the next person and give everyone a chance to recover from the emotional intensity, but Lex barely heard her. All her attention was focused on Savannah's hands trembling as she gripped her drink, her carefully controlled expression cracking to reveal the emotional storm underneath. The truth was finally out, hanging between them like a bridge Lex had built but didn't know if Savannah would cross. 3 years of regret and longing and carefully buried hope suddenly felt possible to carry. If only Savannah would look at her like she used to, like she was worth staying for instead of leaving
From
behind.
years of tropical storms, each one mapped and memorized during the sleepless hours since she'd returned from the bonfire. Savannah had counted them twice, then given up and simply stared at the irregular brown splotches that looked like abstract art in the darkness. I love someone and I never told her before I left. Lex's words echoed in her mind with devastating clarity, each syllable as sharp and immediate as when they'd first been spoken across the crackling fire. The raw vulnerability in Lex's voice, the way she'd looked directly at Savannah while confessing to 12 strangers. It had shattered every carefully constructed wall Savannah had built around her heart over the past 3 years. She rolled onto her side, pressing her face into the pillow that still faintly smelled like Lex from 2 nights ago when they'd shared this bed in the flickering candlelight. That night felt like a lifetime ago now, before the confession had changed everything and nothing all at once. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Lex's face, illuminated by firelight, saw the tears that had threatened to spill as she'd spoken about loving someone she'd been too afraid to claim. The someone who was Savannah. Had to be Savannah. 3 years of believing she'd meant nothing, when maybe, God, maybe, she'd meant everything. Her digital clock read 2:17 a.m., the red numbers accusatory in the darkness. Carmen would be furious if she showed up to tomorrow's activities looking like she'd been hit by a truck, but sleep felt impossible when her entire understanding of the past had been upended in the space of a single honest answer to a party game. Savannah threw off the tangled sheets and padded to the sliding door that led to her private balcony. The ocean stretched endlessly beyond the resort's grounds, black water meeting black sky in a seamless horizon broken only by the silver path of moonlight. The trade winds carried the scent of salt and frangipani, warm against her skin through the thin cotton of her tank top and sleep shorts. Movement felt necessary, like maybe she could walk off the emotional earthquake Lex had triggered. The resort's pathways beckoned in the moonlight, empty and inviting at this hour when even the most dedicated partygoers had finally surrendered to sleep. She slipped her feet into the flip-flops by the door and stepped into the night. The stone walkways were still warm from the day's sun, smooth beneath her feet as she wandered without destination through the sleeping resort. Past the darkened activity pavilion where they'd played that mortifying game just days ago, past the heart deck where she'd first seen Lex again and felt her world tilt off its axis. Everything looked different in the silvery light, softer somehow, like the sharp edges of daylight had been filed down to something manageable. She found herself drawn toward the center of the resort, following the gentle sound of falling water that grew louder as she approached the rain garden. A circular courtyard hidden between 2 wings of guest suites, designed as a meditation space where water cascaded from hidden spouts in the wooden pergola overhead. It was one of her favorite spots during the day when stressed guests needed a moment of peace. But at night, it became something almost magical. The gentle splashing of artificial rain filled the air as she approached, expecting to find the space empty as it always was after midnight. Instead, a familiar silhouette crouched near the central fountain, camera in hand, capturing the interplay of water and shadows in the moonlight. Lex looked up at the sound of Savannah's footsteps, her expression completely unguarded in the silvery light filtering through the pergola's wooden slats. There was no surprise in her dark eyes, only a soft recognition, as if she'd been waiting, hoping Savannah would find her here in this quiet sanctuary away from the rest of the world. The way she held herself, camera forgotten in her lap, shoulders loose and vulnerable, made Savannah's chest tighten with an old familiar ache. Couldn't sleep either? Savannah asked softly, stepping into the courtyard where warm droplets immediately misted her skin. The artificial rain was always set to body temperature, a luxury that felt extravagant during the blazing heat of day but perfect now in the cooler night air. The gentle percussion of water against leaves and stone created an intimate cocoon around them, muffling the distant sounds of the resort. Lex set down her camera with careful precision, shaking her head as she rose from her crouch. Water droplets caught in her loose hair like tiny diamonds, and Savannah noticed how the rain had already begun to dampen her thin cotton shirt, making it cling to the familiar curves of her shoulders. "I keep replaying our entire week," she admitted, her voice barely audible above the gentle splash of water cascading from the hidden spouts above, trying to understand what's real between us and what's just wishful thinking. They stood facing each other in the gentle rain, steam rising faintly from the warm stones beneath their feet, 3 years of unfinished conversations hanging between them like a bridge neither had been brave enough to cross. The moonlight caught the nervous flutter of Lex's hands at her sides, the way her lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to say more but couldn't find the words. Savannah's heart hammered against her ribs, every beat echoing in her ears as the weight of the moment pressed down on her, finally finding the courage to ask the question that had haunted her sleepless nights for 3 years. "Why did you really leave, Lex?" The words came out steadier than she'd expected, given the way her hands were trembling. "And don't say it was about adventure or wanderlust. Don't give me the same lines you've been feeding your followers." Lex's composure crumbled completely, her face collapsing into grief so raw it was painful to witness. Tears spilled over immediately, mixing with the artificial rain as her voice broke on the first word. "My mom," she began, then stopped, pressing her hands to her mouth as if she could hold back the torrent of truth that had been dammed up for years. "She had a complete psychiatric break. Bipolar, but we didn't know then. I got a call from my dad at 3 a.m. She'd been missing for 2 days before they found her. They thought, God, Sav, they thought she might not make it." The revelation hit Savannah like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs and leaving her staring at Lex in shocked understanding. The world seemed to tilt on its axis, everything she'd believed about that summer suddenly shifting into a new, heartbreaking focus. All this time she'd believed Lex had left because what they had meant nothing, when the truth was, she'd left because it had meant everything. The weight of 3 years of misplaced anger settled in her chest like a stone, heavy and cold. "I was 28 and drowning," Lex continued, her voice thick with tears and regret, each word scraped raw from her throat. "She needed round-the-clock care, my dad was falling apart, and I didn't know if she'd ever be okay again. I couldn't bear to ask you to wait when I didn't know how long recovery would take, or if there would even be recovery. I couldn't drag you down with me when you had your whole life figured out." Her breath hitched between words, shoulders shaking as she pressed her palms against her eyes as if she could stop the flood of emotion threatening to overwhelm them both. "Oh, you should have told me," Savannah whispered, but there was no anger left in her voice, only grief for the lost years and the pain they'd both carried unnecessarily. The words came out broken, barely audible over the gentle hiss of the rain system overhead. Her own tears started then, hot tracks on her cheeks that cooled instantly in the misting rain, salt mixing with the artificial precipitation that had witnessed too many confessions tonight. "I know," Lex said brokenly, stepping closer until they were sharing the same space under the falling water, close enough that Savannah could see every tear, every line of anguish carved into her beautiful face. The scent of rain and Lex's familiar perfume wrapped around them like a shroud, intimate and devastating. "I was a coward. I thought I was protecting you, but I was just protecting myself from having to watch you realize I wasn't worth waiting for." The words shattered something fundamental in Savannah's chest, a wall she'd built from hurt and misunderstanding that crumbled to dust in the face of this devastating honesty. The pain was immediate and clean, like pulling shrapnel from a wound that had never properly healed. Without conscious thought, she reached up to cup Lex's face in her hands, thumbs brushing away tears that mixed with the artificial rain streaming down both their faces. Lex's skin was warm and soft beneath her palms, so achingly familiar that Savannah's heart clenched with the memory of every tender touch they'd once shared. "You fucking idiot," she said, but her voice was tender, full of love and exasperation and 3 years of missing someone so desperately it had carved a hole in her chest. "Don't you know I would have waited forever?" When she kissed her this time, it wasn't desperate or afraid like that night in her suite. This kiss was slow and sure, a promise that they were finally in the same place at the same time, finally ready to stop running from the truth they'd both been carrying. Lex's hands wound into her wet hair, holding her like something precious and fragile and worth protecting. Fingertips gentle against her scalp, as if she were afraid Savannah might disappear if she pressed too hard. The kiss deepened as the artificial rain continued to fall around them, warm droplets cascading from the pergola overhead like a benediction. Savannah tasted salt, tears, or rain she couldn't tell, and the familiar sweetness she'd dreamed about for 3 years. Everything felt heightened under the moonlight, every touch electric, every breath shared. The world had narrowed to just this: Lex's mouth against hers, the whisper of fabric clinging to damp skin, the soft splash of rain against stone that matched the rhythm of her pulse. They sank to their knees on the wet stone tiles together, hands trembling as they began to undress each other with reverent care. The rough texture of the tiles bit gently into Savannah's knees, grounding her in the moment even as everything else felt dreamlike. Lex's tank top clung to her skin, translucent with water, and Savannah peeled it away slowly, marveling at the new constellation of freckles across her shoulders from years under foreign sun. Each one was a story she'd missed, a day of Lex's life that had passed without her. Her own clothes felt heavy and restrictive, soaked fabric that seemed to hold all the weight of their separation, and she let Lex remove them piece by piece with patient, worshipful hands, until they knelt naked in the falling rain, 3 years of separation, dissolved in the space between their bodies. Savannah mapped every familiar curve and new mark with her fingertips, rediscovering the geography of Lex's body like a traveler returning to a beloved homeland. The soft curve of her waist, the delicate hollow at the base of her throat that had always driven Savannah to distraction, the way she shivered when Savannah traced the vertebrae of her spine. Water cascaded around them like a blessing, washing away years of hurt and misunderstanding as they came together with desperate tenderness. Every touch felt like coming home and setting sail at the same time, familiar yet new, safe yet thrilling. Savannah had forgotten how perfectly they fit together, how Lex seemed to anticipate her every need and desire. They made love on the wet stones with the artificial rain as their only witness, bodies moving together in a rhythm as natural as breathing. Lex's soft gasps mingled with the splash of water, and Savannah felt 3 years of careful control finally shatter completely as pleasure overwhelmed every rational thought. Afterward, they moved to the cushioned daybed beside the fountain, their bodies still humming with release and reconnection. Savannah curled against Lex's side, her head pillowed on a chest that rose and fell with the same rapid rhythm as her own breathing. The rain had gentled to a fine mist that cooled their overheated skin, and she could hear Lex's heartbeat beneath her ear, strong and steady and real. "Is she okay now?" Savannah asked quietly, her fingers tracing idle patterns on Lex's stomach. "Your mom?" Lex's hand stroked through her damp hair, the touch soothing and grounding. "Better. It took 2 years to find the right combination of medication and therapy, but she's stable now. Happy, even. She asks about you sometimes. She always liked you better than she liked me." A laugh bubbled up from Savannah's chest, surprising them both with its lightness after so much heavy emotion. "She did not." "She absolutely did. She told me I was an idiot for letting you get away, and that was before I told her the whole story." Lex's voice carried a note of rueful amusement. "She's been right about most things lately. I'm starting to think mental health treatment gave her superpowers." For the first time in 3 years, Savannah felt completely present in her own life, terrified and exhilarated by the possibility of loving Lex again. The future stretched before them, uncertain but suddenly bright with possibility. She pressed a kiss to the skin over Lex's heart, tasting chlorine and hope. "We have a lot to figure out," she murmured against Lex's chest, voicing the practical concerns that would inevitably intrude on this perfect bubble they'd created. "We do," Lex agreed, her arms tightening around Savannah's body. "But maybe we can figure it out together this time."
Lex, Chapter 12, Stay or Go. The heart deck had transformed into something out of a tropical fairy tale. String lights cascaded between palm trees like fallen stars, and gauzy white fabric billowed in the evening breeze, creating intimate pockets of conversation throughout the space. Guests laughed and clinked glasses, phones buzzing as contact information was exchanged with promises to stay in touch. The final night mixer had drawn everyone out of their shells. Even the quieter attendees were now animated, sharing stories and making plans to visit each other in their home cities. Lex moved through the crowd with her camera, capturing candid moments of connection. Through her lens, she watched Maya and her new girlfriend slow dancing near the railing, their foreheads pressed together in whispered conversation. Indy was holding court by the bar, already planning a group chat for everyone to share photos after the week ended. The whole scene radiated warmth and belonging, the kind of community Lex had spent years documenting from the outside. She lowered her camera and found Savannah across the deck, orchestrating the evening with the quiet efficiency that made everything look effortless. The warm glow of the fairy lights painted golden highlights across her movements as she directed staff to refill the appetizer stations while simultaneously checking in with guests who looked like they might need a friendly face. Her dark hair had been swept into a loose side braid that caught the twinkling lights as she moved, and she wore a flowing white dress, something gauzy and ethereal that danced around her calves in the ocean breeze. The fabric made her look like she belonged in this magical setting, not just as the person making it happen, but as someone who deserved to be celebrated within it. When Savannah caught her staring, the smile that bloomed across her face wasn't her professional one, the practiced, polite expression she'd worn all week. This was something softer and more private, the kind of smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes and sent warmth spreading through Lex's chest like honey in tea. They hadn't talked about what happened at the rain feature last night, hadn't defined what that stolen kiss meant or where it left them standing, but something fundamental had shifted between them. The careful distance Savannah had maintained all week, the measured words, the cautious glances, the way she'd held herself just out of reach, had dissolved into something more open, more hopeful. Lex's phone buzzed insistently in her pocket, the vibration sharp against her hip with the particular urgent rhythm that meant someone was calling rather than texting. She ignored it, raising her camera again to capture Savannah's laugh as Carmen leaned in to whisper something that made her throw her head back in genuine amusement, the sound carrying across the deck like wind chimes. The phone stopped buzzing for a blessed moment, then immediately started again. And again. With a sigh, Lex stepped away from the crowd, weaving between groups of chatting guests until she reached the relative quiet near the stairs leading down to the beach. The caller ID made her stomach drop. Renee. 3 missed calls in the span of 5 minutes meant this wasn't going to be a casual check-in. "Hey, Renee," Lex answered, pressing the phone closer to her ear as laughter and music drifted from the party behind her. "What's up?" "Lex, darling, finally." Renee's voice cut through the tropical evening air with its usual crisp efficiency. "I need an answer tonight. The European brands want to lock in the contract for the 3-month tour. Flights, hotels, exclusive content deals, everything paid for. It's the opportunity you've been building toward for the past 2 years." The words hit Lex like a splash of cold water, shocking her system back to a reality she'd been carefully avoiding. She'd been so focused on the week, on Savannah, on the strange, intoxicating bubble of intimacy they'd created here among the palm trees and fairy lights, that she'd almost forgotten about the real world waiting for her beyond the resort's gates. 3 months touring Europe, partnering with luxury travel brands, creating the kind of content that could set her up financially for years. It was exactly what she'd told herself she wanted when she'd first agreed to co-host this retreat, back when it was just a job, before Savannah had smiled at her like old times, before everything had gotten complicated again. "The timing is perfect," Renee continued, clearly interpreting Lex's silence as interest rather than the panic currently clawing at her throat. "You finish up this little resort gig, hop on a plane to Madrid, and you're set through the fall. The brands are offering serious money, Lex. Life-changing money. The kind that means you never have to worry about booking rates or seasonal drops again." Lex turned back toward the party, her camera hanging forgotten around her neck like dead weight. The warm glow of string lights blurred slightly as she tried to focus, tried to ground herself in the moment instead of the spiral of what-ifs threatening to pull her under. Across the deck, Savannah was chatting with Maya and Indy, gesturing animatedly with her wine glass as she told some story that had both women doubled over with laughter. The sound carried on the tropical breeze, Rich, unguarded, completely genuine. Savannah looked so completely in her element here. Confident, grounded, surrounded by the community she'd helped create with her careful attention to detail and quiet warmth. The sight made Lex's chest tight with something she couldn't quite name. Longing, maybe, or the sharp, breathless fear of losing something precious, before she'd even figured out what it meant. How could she possibly fit into this world? Savannah had built something real here, something stable and meaningful. She had roots, responsibilities, a life that extended beyond the next Instagram post or brand partnership. What did Lex have to offer except the promise of eventual departure? "I need to think about it," Lex heard herself say, her voice barely audible over the music and conversation flowing around them. "Think about what?" Renee's tone sharpened with impatience. "This is what we've been working toward. The travel market is finally opening up again, and you have the audience and credibility to capitalize on it. You can't seriously be considering turning this down." "I just need some time to process. Can I call you back in an hour?" The pause on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Lex wondered if the call had dropped. When Renee finally spoke, her voice carried the particular kind of frustration reserved for clients who were about to make career-limiting decisions. "Hour, Lex. After that, I'm telling them you're not interested." The line went dead. Lex slipped her phone back into her pocket and stood there for a moment, listening to the sound of waves against the shore, mixing with laughter from above. The fairy lights that had seemed so magical a few minutes ago now felt garish, too bright, highlighting how out of place she felt in this scene of settled happiness. She climbed back up to the deck on unsteady legs, forcing herself to smile and nod at the guests who called out greetings. But everything felt different now, like she was watching the party through glass. She lifted her camera and took photos mechanically, muscle memory guiding her hands while her mind spiraled between the safety of her nomadic lifestyle and the terrifying possibility of staying in one place. "You look like someone at a crossroads." Lex turned to find Carmen approaching with 2 drinks, her expression knowing and slightly concerned. She accepted the offered glass, something fruity with a paper umbrella that looked absurd in her hands, and took a sip without really tasting it. "Is it that obvious?" Lex asked, attempting lightness but hearing the strain in her own voice. Carmen studied her for a moment, then nodded toward Savannah, who was now helping an elderly guest find a comfortable chair. "She's scared too, you know, but she's trying to let herself hope." The words hit Lex like a physical blow. She could see it now that Carmen had pointed it out, the way Savannah's shoulders had relaxed over the past day, the way her smiles had become more frequent and genuine. She was letting her guard down, allowing herself to believe that maybe this time could be different. And here Lex was, already halfway out the door in her mind. "I don't know if I know how to do this," Lex admitted quietly. "The staying thing. I've been moving for so long, I'm not sure I remember how to be still." Armin's expression softened. "Nobody knows how to do anything until they try. And sometimes the scariest thing turns out to be exactly what you need." She clinked her glass against Lex's and melted back into the crowd before Lex could respond. Across the deck, Savannah caught her eye again and smiled. That same soft, real smile that reminded Lex of Barcelona mornings and shared coffee cups and the feeling of waking up next to someone who made the whole world feel possible. The sight made Lex's heart fracture with the weight of wanting something she wasn't sure she deserved. Her phone buzzed again, Renee probably checking in to make sure she was making the right choice. Lex declined the call and shoved the phone deeper into her pocket. "Lex," Indy's voice cut through her spiral of anxiety. The younger woman bounded over with her usual enthusiasm, practically vibrating with excitement about something. "I've been meaning to ask, what are your travel plans after this? Are you staying longer, or is this just another stop on the never-ending adventure?" The innocent question landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples of tension through the immediate area. Lex opened her mouth to give her standard response about always being ready for the next destination, but the words stuck in her throat. She could feel conversations pausing around them as other guests tuned in, suddenly interested in her answer. Maya looked up from her conversation with her girlfriend. Even Carmen had glanced over from where she was organizing empty plates. And Savannah had gone completely still mid-conversation with a guest, her professional smile frozen in place as she clearly strained to hear Lex's response. The silence stretched uncomfortably, thick and heavy as the humid evening air. Indy's bright expression began to falter as she realized she'd somehow stepped into a minefield, her eyes widening with the dawning awareness that her innocent question had detonated something bigger than small talk. Several nearby guests were now openly staring, their conversations forgotten as they waited for Lex to fill the awkward pause with her usual, charming deflection about wanderlust and following the wind, some practiced soundbite about adventure calling and hearts meant to roam. Lex's phone buzzed insistently in her pocket, the vibration thrumming against her thigh like a trapped bird. Renee's name flashed against her leg through the thin fabric, a neon sign pointing toward the exit. 3 months in Europe, life-changing money. The safe, familiar rhythm of always moving, never staying long enough to risk real disappointment, never long enough for anyone to see past the carefully curated highlights reel of her life. She looked at Savannah across the deck and saw hope and terror warring in her expression, two emotions dancing behind those hazel eyes like flames fighting for oxygen. That careful blankness was already beginning to creep across her features, muscle memory taking over as armor slid back into place, piece by piece. Savannah was preparing for the blow she clearly saw coming, the practiced speech about opportunities abroad and commitments to her brand, about how staying in one place too long made her restless. "I don't know," Lex finally admitted, the words coming out quieter than she'd intended, but somehow carrying across the deck anyway. They felt foreign on her tongue, honest in a way that made her chest tight. She, who always had an answer, always had a plan, always had somewhere else to be. She saw something shift in Savannah's expression, the hope flickering out like a candle in the wind, replaced by that awful, careful neutrality that meant she was already building walls again. Brick by brick, the familiar barriers were rising, protecting her from the disappointment that Lex could see settling into the lines of her face. The guest Savannah had been talking to looked confused by the sudden change in energy, glancing between them as if trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces, sensing the undercurrent but unable to name it. Indy's face fell. "Oh, with you and Savannah seeming so..." She trailed off, clearly realizing she was making things worse. "Sorry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot." "It's fine," Lex said automatically, though nothing about this felt fine. Her phone had stopped buzzing, but she could practically feel Renee's impatience radiating through the device. 1 hour. Less than that now. Around them, the party continued, but the magic had gone out of it, like air from a punctured balloon. Conversations resumed with forced brightness, voices pitched just a little too high, people deliberately not looking in their direction as they pretended the awkward moment hadn't happened. The fairy lights still twinkled overhead, the ocean still whispered against the shore, but it all felt hollow now, like watching a movie with the sound turned down. Maya whispered something urgent to her girlfriend, their heads bent together in concern, and they moved further away toward the bar, giving them space that somehow felt more isolating than comforting. Carmen appeared at Savannah's side like a guardian angel in resort khakis, saying something low and urgent that made Savannah nod stiffly, her jaw set in that way Lex remembered from their worst fights years ago. Then she was walking toward the stairs, her movements precise and controlled, her posture rigid with the kind of careful composure that meant she was barely holding herself together. Each step looked deliberate, measured, the walk of someone who refused to run but couldn't bear to stay. Lex stood frozen in place, her sandals rooted to the deck planks, watching the woman she loved disappear into the shadows beyond the pool lights. The warm night air felt suddenly thick and suffocating, heavy with humidity and her own failure. She was undone by her own inability to choose between the life she'd built, all movement and freedom and carefully curated adventure, and the life she wanted, which was standing right here, walking away from her again. Her camera felt impossibly heavy around her neck, the leather strap cutting into her skin. A reminder of all the moments she'd captured from the outside, always the observer framing other people's stories, never quite willing to step into the frame herself and risk being seen. Indy touched her arm gently. "Maybe you should go after her?" But Lex's feet felt rooted to the deck, paralyzed by the weight of a decision she wasn't sure she was brave enough to make.
Lex, Chapter 13, Room for Two. Savannah curled her legs beneath her on the small balcony chair, cradling a glass of Sauvignon Blanc that had gone warm in the humid evening air. Below, in the parking lot, the last few guests were loading their cars with beach bags and souvenir rum bottles, engines starting up one by one, as Sapphic Singles Week officially came to an end. Maya and her girlfriend were taking forever saying goodbye to everyone, their laughter floating up through the palm fronds like the remnants of a party that had already moved on without her. She'd thrown herself into checkout logistics all morning, processing final bills, coordinating shuttle schedules, making sure the housekeeping team had everything they needed to reset the suites for the next group. Anything to avoid thinking about Lex's deer-in-headlights expression when Indy had asked about staying. That awful moment when hope had bloomed in her chest only to get crushed under the weight of Lex's silence, her face cycling through emotions too quickly to read before landing on that familiar, polite uncertainty. I don't know. The words had been echoing in her head for the past 18 hours, bouncing around her skull like a pinball hitting every sensitive spot she'd tried to protect. Of course Lex didn't know. Why would she? This was what Savannah got for allowing herself to believe that amazing sex and honest conversation could somehow override 7 years of evidence that Lex Calderon was fundamentally incapable of staying in one place long enough to build anything real. She took another sip of wine and watched Indy and Taylor loading their Jeep, both of them stealing glances up at the resort buildings like they were trying to memorize something beautiful before it disappeared. They'd exchanged numbers with half the group, making plans to meet up in different cities, already talking about next year's retreat like it was a foregone conclusion. That was the magic of these events. People came looking for connection and actually found it, creating little pockets of community that would stretch across the country through text threads and weekend visits. Savannah had watched it happen dozens of times, had helped facilitate those connections with carefully planned activities and perfectly timed introductions. She was good at creating space for love to bloom, at reading the room and knowing when to push people together and when to let chemistry work its own magic. But apparently, she was terrible at recognizing when someone was trying to choose her. A soft knock at her door made her heart skip in that traitorous way it had been doing all week whenever she caught sight of dark hair in her peripheral vision. She considered ignoring it, probably Carmen checking to make sure she wasn't drowning in post-retreat melancholy. But the knocking came again, gentle but persistent. She padded to the door in bare feet, wineglass still in hand, and opened it to find Lex standing in the hallway holding 2 perfect mojitos with lime garnishes twisted just so. Her camera bag was slung over one shoulder, and there was a small rolling suitcase at her feet that made Savannah's stomach clench with recognition. Departure preparations. Of course. I brought drinks, Lex said quietly, offering one of the glasses with a nervous smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Her hands were trembling slightly as she extended the mojito, ice cubes clinking against the glass in a rhythm that matched Savannah's suddenly erratic heartbeat. Savannah accepted the drink automatically, their fingers brushing for just a moment before Lex pulled back like she'd been burned. The mojito was perfectly balanced, not too sweet, with just enough mint to make her mouth tingle. Even when she was clearly a mess, Lex still paid attention to details like that, still remembered exactly how Savannah liked her drinks. I thought we should talk, Lex continued, shifting her weight from foot to foot, but not presuming to enter uninvited. There was something different about her posture, a kind of nervous energy that felt more authentic than the confident influencer persona she'd been wearing all week. Her hair was pulled back in a messy bun secured with what looked like a pencil, and she was wearing one of those soft cotton tank tops that made her collarbones look impossibly elegant. Savannah took a careful sip of her mojito, buying time while she tried to read Lex's expression. About your travel plans? Because I'm pretty sure Indy got the message last night. Actually, about the opposite. Lex stepped closer to the threshold, close enough that Savannah could smell her perfume. Something citrusy and clean that brought back sense memories of tangled sheets and whispered confessions. I called Renee an hour ago and turned down the European deal. Told her I'm taking an indefinite sabbatical from the influencer circuit. The words hit Savannah like a physical blow, making her grip tighten around her glass until her knuckles went white. She stared at Lex's face, searching for signs of performance or manipulation, but found only raw honesty that made her chest ache with possibility. You did what? The question came out rougher than she intended, disbelief and hope warring in her voice. Lex's smile was small and genuine, nothing like the camera-ready grins she'd been flashing all week. I don't have a return flight. I canceled it this morning. She paused, taking a shaky breath before continuing. I'm not going anywhere, Sav, unless you ask me to. The words hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. loaded with 7 years of history and the weight of choosing each other despite every reason to protect themselves. Savannah felt something shift in her chest, armor she'd been carrying for so long that she'd forgotten how heavy it was until it started to fall away piece by piece. Instead of speaking, because what could she possibly say that would be adequate for this moment? Savannah stepped back and opened the door wider, her eyes never leaving Lex's face. She watched emotions flicker across those familiar features like sunlight through water. Relief and terror and love all mixed together in an expression so vulnerable it made her want to reach out and touch, just to make sure this was really happening. When Lex crossed the threshold with her suitcase rolling behind her, it felt like the most important decision either of them had ever made. They settled on the couch with their drinks, Lex curled into the corner with her legs tucked beneath her, the suitcase sitting by the door like a promise neither of them was quite ready to acknowledge. For the first time all week, conversation flowed easily about guest feedback and repeat bookings, about Lex's ideas for a photography series documenting queer-owned businesses throughout the Caribbean, about Savannah's half-formed plans to expand the resort's activities programming to include more adventure excursions. Maya suggested adding a sailing component, Savannah said, swirling the ice in her glass. Something about how being on the water together creates instant intimacy. She glanced at Lex sideways. Though I guess you'd know something about that with all your travel experience. Actually, I've been thinking lately that I don't know much about anything real, Lex admitted, setting her mostly empty mojito on the coffee table. Spending 3 days in a place and pretending to understand its essence, taking photos of experiences I'm not actually having. It's all pretty hollow when you step back and look at it. There was something different in her voice, a tiredness that went deeper than physical exhaustion. Savannah had seen glimpses of it all week, moments when Lex's camera stayed around her neck instead of pressed to her eye, when she participated in activities instead of just documenting them for content. What made you decide? Savannah asked as they finished their drinks, the question she'd been circling around finally finding its way to her lips. About the sabbatical, I mean. And staying. Lex set down her glass and was quiet for a long moment, her gaze drifting toward the sliding door that led to the balcony. The last traces of sunset were fading from purple to deep blue, and the first stars were beginning to appear between the palm fronds. Watching you this week, she said finally, her voice soft but certain, remembering what it felt like to be part of something real instead of just documenting other people's lives. You built something here, Sav, something that matters. And I've been running from place to place for years, collecting experiences like souvenirs, but never actually building anything that could last. She turned to face Savannah fully, her expression open in a way that made Savannah's chest tight with emotion. I want to try building something with you, not just filming it or writing about it for strangers on the internet, actually doing the work of staying and figuring out how to make it work day by day. When Lex reached for her hand, Savannah didn't pull away. Their fingers intertwined naturally, muscle memory from that summer 7 years ago, when they'd walked everywhere, connected, when touch had been as essential as breathing. Sitting there on her couch with cocktail glasses on the coffee table and Lex's suitcase by the door, she realized this was what she'd been waiting for, not grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but the simple choice to stay and build something together. I've missed you, Savannah said quietly, the admission feeling both enormous and inadequate. Not just the idea of you or the way I remembered that summer. I've missed this. Talking to you. Being known by you. Lex squeezed her hand. I've missed you too. Every day for 7 years. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, processing the weight of admissions that felt too big for words. Outside, the resort was settling into its evening rhythm, distant laughter from the bar, the soft splash of late-night swimmers, the endless whisper of waves against sand, all the sounds of a place where people came to find connection, and sometimes actually succeeded. Savannah stood first, tugging gently on Lex's hand. Come on. They moved toward the bedroom slowly, deliberately, like people who understood that time was no longer their enemy. Lex's hands were gentle as they worked the buttons of Savannah's linen shirt, her touch reverent and careful as if she were handling something precious that might break if she moved too quickly. When Savannah lifted Lex's tank top over her head, she pressed a soft kiss to the spot just below her ear that used to make her shiver, smiling when it still had the same effect. There was no desperation this time, no fear that morning would tear them apart again. They undressed each other with the careful attention of people who knew this time mattered, who were choosing each other with full awareness of the risks and deciding that love was worth the possibility of heartbreak. When they finally came together, skin against skin, it felt like coming home and setting sail at the same time. Familiar and new, safe and adventurous. Everything Savannah had been too afraid to hope for. Afterward, they lay tangled together, talking until dawn about everything and nothing. Past heartbreaks and future dreams, the logistics of Lex transitioning her brand from constant travel to something more rooted, Savannah's ideas for expanding the resort's programming to include photography workshops and creative retreats. Their voices grew softer as exhaustion finally began to claim them, but neither wanted to sleep and break the spell of finally being honest with each other. "I want to document this place properly," Lex murmured against Savannah's shoulder as the first hints of sunrise began to filter through the curtains. "Not as content, but as a love letter. Show people what you've built here and why it matters." "I'd like that," Savannah whispered back, her fingers tracing lazy patterns on Lex's back. "I'd like having you here to see it all. The good days and the chaotic ones, and the perfectly ordinary ones in between." When Savannah finally woke, hours later, sunlight was streaming through the curtains in golden bars across the hardwood floor, and she could hear the soft sound of movement from the kitchenette. She stretched luxuriously, her body deliciously sore in all the right places, and found Lex standing at the counter in one of Savannah's oversized resort t-shirts, humming quietly as steam rose from 2 coffee mugs. Lex's suitcase still sat unpacked in the corner, but somehow it no longer looked like departure preparation. It looked like possibility, like all the tomorrows they were finally brave enough to imagine together. When their eyes met over steaming mugs of perfectly prepared coffee, Savannah knew with absolute certainty that this time neither of them was running away. Lex epilogue. The other side of the camera. The morning light streaming through the windows of the small office above Coral Bay Resort caught the dust motes dancing in the air like tiny stars. Lex adjusted her phone on the makeshift tripod she'd constructed from a stack of resort brochures and a coffee mug, checking the angle twice before stepping back to survey her setup. Behind her, the wall displayed a carefully curated collection of her favorite photographs from the past month. Candid shots of guests discovering hidden coves, impromptu dance parties on the beach, and right in the center, that perfect image of Savannah laughing at the Cove Trail, her guard completely down for once. She had been planning this recording for weeks, scripting and re-scripting the words in her head until Savannah finally told her to stop overthinking and just talk to her followers like she always did. Easier said than done when everything about her life had shifted so dramatically that even she wasn't sure how to explain it. Taking a deep breath, she hit record and stepped into frame, her voice carrying the familiar warmth of her travel vlogs, but with something new underneath, a groundedness that came from finally knowing where she belonged. "Hey gorgeous humans, Lex here, and I know this setup looks a little different than usual. No exotic beaches or bustling markets behind me today." She gestured to the cozy office space around her, with its whiteboard covered in colorful sticky notes and the desk scattered with event schedules, vendor contacts, and coffee cups. "I'm coming to you from my new home base at Coral Bay Resort, where I've been working on something completely different." The planning boards behind her told the story of the past month in rainbow-colored post-its and hurried handwriting, a kaleidoscope of ambition that would have overwhelmed her old nomadic self. Retreat schedules layered over workshop ideas, vendor lists for local artists and photographers. She'd spent afternoons getting to know over rum punches and shared stories about creative passion, menu planning for dietary restrictions she'd never had to consider when she was just one person with a backpack and whatever street food looked promising. The whiteboard looked like pure chaos to anyone else, a hurricane of colorful notes and connecting arrows that defied any logical organizational system. But to Lex, it represented the most purposeful work she'd ever done. the kind that kept her awake at night, not from anxiety, but from excitement. I have been collaborating with the incredible team here to create something I never thought I'd be interested in, putting down roots. She picked up a stack of registration forms from the desk, the paper edges soft from handling and rehandling, unable to keep the genuine excitement out of her voice, even as she fought the instinct to perform her enthusiasm for the camera. Instead of just passing through places and moving on to the next adventure, I'm actually building something lasting here. Coral Bay's first permanent queer creative retreat program. The door opened mid-sentence with the soft, familiar squeak of hinges that had become as much a part of her morning routine as checking the sunrise, and Savannah appeared in the doorway holding 2 steaming mugs like some sort of caffeinated guardian angel. She paused there for a moment, surveying Lex's camera setup with the fond exasperation that had replaced their old tentative politeness. The look of someone who'd grown used to finding her girlfriend talking earnestly to a lens at ungodly hours of the morning. "Are you seriously using your influencer voice to talk about spreadsheets?" Savannah crossed to the desk with the unhurried grace that came from months of navigating resort logistics, setting down one mug within Lex's reach while keeping the other protectively close to her chest like a shield against the morning. The rich scent of good coffee, not the instant stuff from her travel days, filled the space between them. "Your followers are going to think you've been body snatched by someone who knows what a profit margin is." Lex grinned and reached for the offered coffee, her fingers brushing Savannah's for just a moment longer than necessary, not bothering to stop recording even as warmth that had nothing to do with caffeine spread through her chest. The casual intrusion felt natural now, inevitable, in the best way. After weeks of Savannah wandering in and out of her creative process with coffee, logistical questions and gentle mockery of her more dramatic camera angles, in that "Savannah, my business partner, and..." "Don't you dare introduce me to the internet as your gorgeous co-host or I'm putting decaf in your mug tomorrow." Savannah cut her off with a laugh that bubbled up from somewhere deep and genuine, though she moved closer to the desk instead of retreating, her hip bumping against the corner in a way that brought her into the frame's edge. Her dark hair was still slightly mussed from sleep, catching the morning light streaming through the office windows, and she wore one of her crisp resort t-shirts tucked into perfectly pressed khaki shorts. The picture of professional competence, if you ignored the way her eyes crinkled with barely contained amusement, or the small smile she was failing to hide behind her coffee mug. Fine, Lex amended, reaching out to pull Savannah into frame where she waved awkwardly at the camera, still holding her own coffee mug like a shield. "She's the brilliant operations manager who's helping me launch this whole project, and also happens to be the reason I finally stopped running around the world looking for the next adventure." "Lex," Savannah warned, her cheeks flushing pink, but she didn't step away when Lex's arms settled comfortably around her waist. The gesture had become second nature over the past weeks, but seeing it happen on camera made them both acutely aware of how naturally they'd fallen back into each other's orbit. "I'm protesting being filmed before my second cup of coffee," Savannah said to the phone, though her tone was more fond than genuinely annoyed. "And also being volunteered to charm your followers before I'm fully awake and functional." Their easy banter played naturally for the camera, showing a side of Lex her followers had never seen before. Gone was the solo adventurer always chasing the horizon. In her place was a woman who'd found something worth slowing down for, someone whose happiness was clearly tied to the person standing beside her. "So instead of chasing the next destination like I've been doing for years," Lex continued, her voice growing more earnest as she looked directly into the camera, "I'm building something lasting here. Documenting stories of people finding community and creativity in one beautiful place instead of always searching for what might be around the next corner." The words felt strange and wonderful in her mouth, a declaration she never would have imagined making 6 months ago when her entire identity was built around movement and change. Back then, the idea of staying anywhere longer than a season would have sent her reaching for her passport and the familiar rush of planning an escape. But standing here in their shared office space, surrounded by the gentle hum of the air conditioning and the afternoon sunlight streaming through windows they'd picked out together, with Savannah's solid, reassuring presence anchoring her like a steady heartbeat, she couldn't imagine wanting to be anywhere else. The room smelled like Savannah's vanilla coffee and the faint salt breeze that perpetually drifted through their open balcony door, scents that had become synonymous with home in a way that still caught Lex off guard with its simple rightness. "God, you're getting sentimental on camera," Savannah muttered into her coffee mug, her voice carrying that particular blend of fondness and mock exasperation that had become their signature dynamic. The words earned her a gentle elbow to the ribs from Lex, who couldn't quite suppress the laugh bubbling up in her chest. But Savannah was smiling as she said it, really smiling, with that soft, unguarded expression that crinkled the corners of her eyes and made her whole face luminous. It was the kind of smile Lex had been privileged to witness more and more often as the walls between them had finally come down for good, brick by careful brick, until all that remained was this easy intimacy that felt both hard-won and effortless. Without thinking, Lex leaned over to kiss Savannah's temple mid-recording, her lips finding the familiar warmth of skin just above her hairline. The gesture was so natural and affectionate, as automatic as breathing, that both women paused afterward, slightly stunned by their own ease. Lex could taste the faint sweetness of Savannah's shampoo, could feel the way her girlfriend's breath caught just slightly at the unexpected tenderness. It had become routine in private, these casual touches and stolen kisses throughout their busy days. The way Savannah would rest her hand on Lex's lower back when passing behind her desk, or how Lex would absently play with the ends of Savannah's hair during their evening planning sessions. But something about doing it for an audience, about letting their followers witness this unscripted moment of pure affection, made them both acutely aware of how far they'd traveled from those first tense, guarded days of working together again. "Okay, that's definitely going in the blooper reel," Savannah said, her flush deepening as she reached over to steal a sip from Lex's mug with the casual intimacy of someone who'd been sharing morning coffee for months instead of weeks. "Are you almost done with your little documentary? The first group arrives in an hour, and I need you to help me charm them into thinking we actually know what we're doing." Lex chuckled, wrapping up the vlog quickly with promises to share updates on the creative retreat project and behind-the-scenes glimpses of what it looked like to build something from scratch. She hit stop and set the phone aside, immediately shifting her full attention to Savannah with the kind of focus that still made her girlfriend's breath catch sometime. "Ready to meet our guinea pigs?" she asked, pulling Savannah closer by her belt loops. "They're not guinea pigs, they're paying guests," Savannah corrected automatically, but her eyes were sparkling with the excitement that had been building all week as their first official creative retreat approached. Paying guests who trusted us enough to book a program that exists mostly in our heads and on those color-coded planning boards. "Hey, those planning boards are works of art," Lex protested. "Carmen said they're the most organized thing she's ever seen in this resort, and that's including your legendary spreadsheet collection." Savannah laughed, the sound warm and unguarded in the morning light. "Carmen also said she can't believe I let you convince me to run a program that includes intuitive creative expression and authentic storytelling workshops without having nervous breakdowns about the lack of concrete deliverables. And yet here you are, about to welcome 12 artists and photographers for a week of exactly that," Lex pointed out, smoothing down a stray piece of Savannah's hair. "Funny how things work out when you let yourself trust the process." "I'm trusting you," Savannah corrected, her voice softer now. "There's a difference." The words hit Lex square in the chest with their quiet intensity. After years of being someone people followed for entertainment or inspiration but never really relied on, the weight of Savannah's trust felt both thrilling and terrifying. She'd built an entire brand around being the free spirit who didn't get tied down, and now here she was, co-creating something that required commitment, consistency, and faith in a future she couldn't predict or control. "Don't get all misty-eyed on me now," Savannah said, though she was smiling as she reached up to trace the line of Lex's jaw with her fingertips. "Save the emotional declarations for when our guests arrive and you need to convince them that staying in one place can be just as transformative as wandering the globe." Hand in hand, they headed downstairs toward the Heart Deck, where Carmen was already setting up welcome stations with her usual efficiency. The familiar sounds of the resort coming to life surrounded them. The distant splash of early morning swimmers, the clatter of breakfast prep from the kitchen, the soft whir of maintenance crews refreshing the common areas. All the rhythms Lex had learned by heart over the past month. The patterns that had started to feel like home in a way no destination ever had. As they reached the main level, Lex felt a deep contentment settle in her chest. A sense of rightness that had nothing to do with passport stamps or viral content and everything to do with the woman beside her and the life they were building together. She'd spent years documenting other people's adventures, always moving toward the next experience, the next story, the next beautiful backdrop for her carefully curated wanderlust. But standing here in the early morning light with Savannah's hand warm in hers and their first creative retreat about to begin, she realized she'd finally found the adventure worth staying for.
Thank you so much for listening. Please subscribe, leave a comment, and review.